Sharon. Sharon, definitely. Okay.
The only thing y'all like is philosophy. I noticed that on Thursday.
Yeah, never miss that. You gotta take his phone.
Crack me up. Especially Nuri.
Okay, we're live.
Okay.
When the time comes.
We were in School of Philosophy and Black Liberation.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. Today, we're going to talk about the significance of the Trump administration and its move towards ending the war in Ukraine, and the significance of this in terms of a new ideological movement for humanity and the American people. So I'll turn it to Doc to begin the discussion.
Thanks a lot. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you.
To Saturday Free School.
Happy to be here.
Well, it's been an eventful week. We're at the end of the fourth week of the Trump administration. And, people are still trying to make sense of what's going on, as we should. And I guess I should say, for those people writing emails to people, what the free school is doing and how we're anti-immigrant. When damn near everybody in here is an immigrant or child of an immigrant. But it is part, I should say, I was just saying to Kath and somebody else, how angry it makes me that this type of smearing is become so normalized that any discussion, if it doesn't fit the dominant narrative, which is the neocons and the war maker narrative, if you don't fall into that, then somehow you're a cheerleader for Trump. If the free school is a cheerleader for anything, it's for peace. And the good thing is, it's no secret what we stand for, because we video it, live stream it every week, and it's archived. And if you want to know what we think, you can find it here. And it reminds you of the 1950s even, the McCarthyite period, where, like Du Bois said, dissent was criminalized. But the difference here, and I think we've said this so often, this is a moment unlike any other in the history of the country. The 2024 election was perhaps the most consequential since 1860, and maybe the most consequential in the history of the country. And it was consequential because it began full-throatedly what we can only call an imperial retreat. So I'll just say, as everybody knows, Trump reached out to Putin. This is something that Biden and his administration refused to do, said they would not do it. Put Russia and Putin in the category of enemy, which meant that only war would bring him, that is Putin, to his senses. So anyone with an ounce of sense knew that were Biden or Kamala Harris reelected, it would only be more war. There is no two ways about this. And therefore, Trump's reaching out to Putin, and he's saying it was a warm telephone call of over an hour and a half. and then for Rubio and Mike Waltz, who's the National Security Director, and Weizkoff to meet with Lavrov and his delegation from Russia in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, was a very significant move away from peace and towards what we call détente or peaceful coexistence. In a certain sense, everyone can breathe easier. I know we can, I know I can. We were so close to an all-European war, maybe a world war. And the Biden administration was playing brinksmanship. And let us remember what this war was about. This was a war that was provoked by the Biden administration. And that seems, given, what the narrative is, what the propaganda is. Well, how could you say that? The Russians invaded Ukraine. But the question has to be asked, why? And what led up to this? And had not the Russian government said in 2021 and even before that it is a red line. Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO. You cannot put these weapons that could reach the Russian government in 5 or 10 minutes on our borders. And that to do that would constitute an act of war. But Biden and his administration went forward with it, knowing what the Russian position was and refusing to negotiate or even talk about it, saying, as you know, that Ukraine is a sovereign nation and it has a right to join NATO if it wishes to. But so is Russia a sovereign nation, and it has a right to defend its sovereignty. The second part of all of this, which has kind of been lost, the sanction regime and all of that, and then of course, turning this into a war and a never-ending type of war to weaken Russia and to ultimately bring the Putin government down, and then to do what they wish, anything they wish to do with Russia, including dividing it up. It was, when you think about it, the intent of the United States and its Western allies was so evil that it's difficult to find the words to express it. But most people don't know this. The media has played such a huge role in all of this. But it is almost like we live in a different world from when Biden and those were in until now. And Trump effectively is a peacemaker. I don't know what else to say. He is not the peacemaker that we want, but he is a peacemaker. It is a retreat from war. And the other thing, one of the last things that Barack Obama did as president was to shut down many of the Russian consulates in the United States and to downgrade its diplomatic staff almost to a state of not existing. And then, of course, the whole thing where the Russian embassy and consulates could not do business through American banks. So anything they paid for, they had to go and get money from Russia, dollars from Russia, and pay in cash. It was it was an act of establishing Russia. And this was not on the basis of Ukraine. This was on the basis of having gotten involved in the U.S. 2016 election and so on. So we're going to punish them. But when I put it all together, it seems to me that it was kind of a process leading up to this situation, which then provoked this war. And I would say just a quick look. If a person's or group's or anybody's analysis is based upon following the mainstream media, if that's where you get all your information, and you think that our national security is achieved through a war with Russia, don't get mad at people who say you don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, the last week with last Saturday, J.D. Vance, the vice president, spoke at the Munich Security Conference, an annual event that promotes war. You know, let's be real, where usually the vice president of the United States goes with all these generals and senators and stuff, and all of the NATO countries show up, along with others like China. The Chinese foreign minister was there this year. And J.D. Vance, rather than attack Russia, attacked all the NATO allies. And the political point is literally a withdrawal from NATO. And this is hugely significant. NATO is 75 years old. It's part of the international architecture after World War II. And it's the core of it, both the financial system, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the ways they would use the UN Security Council, and other things would establish as a dominant force in world politics the United States and the West. Soviet Union was weak. 27 million people had been killed in that war. That's a lot to come back from. The United States was untouched. Europe had been part of the war, but they were not devastated. The war was literally fought in the Soviet Union and such. NATO was the big stick. And as we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO becomes a force outside of Europe, especially in the Iraq War, in the Afghanistan War, and they used Article 5 of the NATO treaty, that if one nation is militarily attacked, all nations in NATO would respond. Well, what J.D. Vance and Trump are saying is that Article 5 will not apply anymore. More than that, they're saying that Europe must defend itself, which it can, but it doesn't have anything to defend against to begin with. The NATO treaty outside of the U.S., which would be the big stick, was about preventing the governments of Germany and France, the major European countries, going towards socialism or communism. That's why the whole foundation ideologically of NATO is anti-communism. And then, of course, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund would step in where the former colonial nations like Britain, France, Belgium, etc., who as a consequence of 2 world wars were unable to hold on to its colonies. They were ruined. Europe had collapsed. 2 world wars and a Great Depression. So it's the United States and this new financial architecture, which would say, well, we accept the independence of India or Nigeria or, whatever, Belgium, the Congo, I'm sorry. But your economies will be tied to the currencies of the former colonial nations. And by that, they were able to control these nations' economies. And then, of course, with the CIA, which would then come in and overthrow governments. The assassination in 1961 of Patrice Lumumba, that was all, the CIA hands are all over that. The overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. These were governments that arose on the independence movements, and they were overthrown, and then their economies were controlled by these international financial institutions, establishing the architecture of what we call neo-colonialism. Now, but it all depended upon the strength of the US dollar, the military strength of the United States. This can now not be relied upon. This is very significant. And it is an ideological moment for the world's people and for many governments around the world. Countries like India, a huge nation, if it moves towards a firm commitment to this new movement of the global South, as it is called, this so shifts the balance of world forces that it's very difficult to even understand how the United States can even think of playing the role it has played over 75 years. There's not so much to tell you or talk about that, just to lay out the framing of it. To undermine that is almost epic in its transformation of the world situation. And for Marco Rubio, and of course, these people are not speaking for themselves. This is the line of the Trump presidency to say that we live in a multipolar world, that the unipolar moment was just that, a moment, which was unusual and abnormal, and that multipolarity is the real state of things. And I read that as also a way of talking about a retreat from war and a retreat from the neocons and war makers. But the ideological moment, I think, is very important. It might say something that Trump's ratings, maybe a week ago, were higher than they were when he was elected, and are higher now than they ever were during his first presidency. I think there is something about being a peacemaker, or perceived as such by a good part of the American public, resonates. And we've kind of said it over and over here. The American people are exhausted of war. They don't want war anymore. The other thing, to attack the bureaucracy and in some ways the state itself, resonates with people who feel that the government, and the polling data has shown this over and over again, where 70 or 80% of American people say the government doesn't care about people like that. So why would the people rise up and say, well, don't do away with USAID. We need USAID.
Right. Right.
But ain't nobody saying that except people who work for USAID. And, you know, those people aligned to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party cannot even mobilize its base because they too are saying, we want peace. We don't want this brinksmanship. And also, the anti-government sentiment in the country is so deep. So, just on the ideological question of the moment, I think we are close to crossing that Rubicon, by which I mean that the neocons, and these are very dangerous people, very dangerous, very powerful people. You know, we can name some of the Robert Kagans, the Victoria Newlands, I forget some of the ones who, from back in the days, started a lot of this. That is, when I say back in the days, in the early 1990s. But I think the American people are in a place that they've never been and that they will not return from. You know, it's kind of ironic that the threat of fascism does not come from the Trump movement as much as from the Democratic Party, the war makers. I think, you know, there's something totally out of kilter in people's understanding of fascism. You know, it's probably because we define fascism based on what we see or the form that we think fascism would take and not the essence of fascism. Fascism, in essence, cannot be separated from war. If you're going to call Trump the second coming of Hitler, why is it that he is not doing what Hitler did, or better, uniting Europe, upholding NATO to attack and go to war with Russia? That is what a fascist would do. Well, who did that? Joe Biden. So, I mean, by any historical definition of fascism, I think you would have to say that the Biden administration, through its pursuance of war, and it was, I mean, in Gaza, of course, in Russia, in Ukraine, it was war. So the American people, I don't think, ideologically or politically, will go back to that. They won't. The other thing is that the world has changed ideologically. It's not the same world. The people of the planet are different, and it happened very quickly. And I think the two, you could say, moral ideological questions were the war in Ukraine, which was not supported by the majority of the world's people, and Gaza. And the U.S. is now viewed as an adversary, almost an enemy of the world's people. Trump's move away from that might repair the position of the U.S. in the world. Of course, you know, and when he calls for the three superpowers, Russia, United States, and China, to cut their military budgets by 50%. He calls for denuclearization. When he calls for a summit of Putin, Xi Jinping, and himself. This is, I mean, it's so significant that it's no way to minimize the significance. And, Shantanu and I were talking yesterday, I think Modi understands this, has gotten a message, and certainly the coup in Bangladesh, which everybody knows was engineered by the United States and the National Endowment for Democracy and probably USAID and all of that. They have to know what that means. I think the growing rapprochement between India and China, hugely significant, um, et cetera. So the world's people and governments of the world are looking at things differently. The numbers of countries that want to join BRICS now, which makes BRICS more important than the G7, that is the European capitalist, mainly European capitalist nations, and the G20. And really, these moves are sidelining Europe. The colonial powers, the major empires that pillaged and robbed all the nations of what they now call the global South. Europe is now a secondary player. Germany, the major economic power in Europe, is on its knees economically. They've been in a 2-year recession. So we are in that kind of, I won't say axial age, but a shift in the axis of geostrategic power. And certainly, we will revisit the Korean Peninsula. And it was John Bolton and what was the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, that sabotaged that movement towards peace on the Korean Peninsula. But I think with this overreach of the Korean government and this coup, this president, is he still locked up?
Yeah.
Great. Oh, that's a beautiful thing. And and I guess the last thing I just want to say is we had a really wonderful thing at the Central Branch of the Free Library on Thursday. And it was really something in tribute to the Free Library and the staff there, and their generosity, their openness, because they had gotten that series of emails that had been sent all around the city saying that the free school are Trump supporters, the free school, to kind of discourage people from reaching out or allowing us to have reading groups or lectures or whatever, and all of these fake names. Which I always say, if you got something to say, come on here. I mean, we're very transparent, probably too much so, that we live stream, we archive it all, and listen to what we say. But in spite of that, the Central Branch was very generous. Really, a good number of people turned out, and a lot of people asked questions. But the thing I want to say is that, once the ice was broken, and with the so-called end of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was then acceptable or permissible in universities and in public discourse to mention the name Du Bois. I don't think you guys can really understand how thorough the campaign to eliminate him from public discourse. And it came from all kinds of places. It came from the liberals. It came, and this is from the cultural nationalists and Afrocentrists who claimed that he wasn't black. Yeah, he was, and that it was Garvey and Garveyism. And then almost immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you got David Levering Lewis's 2-volume biography of Du Bois, which is not bad. The first volume is much better than the second volume because the second volume is Lewis going over to all of, or many of the anti-communist tropes that were used against Du Bois. But nonetheless, it was a major attempt to talk about the intellectual biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, and then the documentary made by Louis Messiah, which came out, I think, in the middle 90s, called W.E.B. Du Bois, A Biography in Four Voices, which is not bad, you know. And so it became permissible to have courses on Du Bois at major universities. You know, as I was saying, I went to a black college at the height of the Cold War. You couldn't mention the name Du Bois. You don't have no courses on him in history classes and in sociology classes. No mention of Du Bois. And I don't excuse the university and the professors, even at that time, for their cowardice, their bootlicking. You understand? But they nonetheless did. So once Du Bois it becomes permissible to discuss him, and then we in the Free School in 2018 did a year of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was very successful. And so the opposition to Du Bois could no longer position itself as being anti-Du Bois, because that would make them look like complete idiots, even though they are that, but, you know, it'd be on display for everybody. They couldn't come in that form. And so the Garveyites had to go into retreat and get in a corner and pout. We're not going to come to anything the Free School does.
That's what
We don't like them.
That's crazy, yeah.
But then they moved to another track and create a Saturday fake school that claimed Du Bois, but don't know Du Bois. So it was a very important event at the Free Library. And it really comes on the heels of a whole year of reading Baldwin there. I mean, it's just, one cannot express, you know, the gratitude of the gratitude towards the Free Library. But, and here's, I think, the ideological significance. We, I think, are going beyond this discussion of Du Bois in the most narrow, almost trivial ways. He was a great Black thinker. And once you say Black, you qualify with Black for most people, including Black people. It means lesser than all European thinkers. Or another group would say, well, Du Bois is the America's Lenin.
Right.
Well, you've not done Du Bois a favor by putting it that way. I mean, would you think of ever saying that Lenin is Russia's Du Bois?
Right.
Of course not. You know, I find it interesting, this, the study of Black Reconstruction. I put quotes around the study because they don't even know what they're reading. We're going to read Black Reconstruction, and we're teaching Black Reconstruction, you know. It's a joke. It's fake. But then the other move, which I saw recently, some guy wrote it, Du Bois as a theorist of class struggle. Okay. We've been saying that for what, 10 years now. So hope that I accuse you of plagiarizing on the highest level. But okay, I understand you're trying to get publications and maybe get a job in a university. But you're not really establishing who Du Bois really was. And that's why I think the event at the Free Library, especially Leonardo da Vinci and Du Bois, and even to try to think about the origins of a new world movement of thought. And did a new moment begin after the freeing of the slaves? And hence, even within the framing of modernity, a new world movement of thought. I think that is what Du Bois constitutes. And the idea of art and science and the epistemologies that must emerge in order to explain that connection. And this, we do more on this because this is what Leonardo da Vinci was doing. And I think for Du Bois to, at 22, 23 years old, to assert that Leonardo is the founder of experimental science, not Francis Bacon, as most of us would think. And so it is with Du Bois. And, well, I'm not going to repeat what I said there, but you look at his work, and you're always being, how would you say, pushed towards art. He says, I want to do sociology scientifically. I want to make it a science. A part of that, by the way, is that most sociologists of this period, the early period of his life, his academic career, said that African Americans could not be studied using sociology. To study us, you'd have to do biology or anthropology, because we were so low on the level of civilization, we had not reached the level of humanity, which was an assumption of the social science. Social science studies human societies. We were not human. We could not be studied as such. To which Du Bois answers, they don't know what they're talking about. They have not yet discovered how to do scientific sociology. And he says, I will put science into sociology. And he says these things not in grandiose statements, in very simple ways. He says, I'll take philosophy, I'll join philosophy and history, and out of this union will come sociology. And I'm still trying to figure that out. But we can talk about that. So I think this ideological moment provides areas for theoretical development, for revisiting Du Bois, and this is very, very important, especially for the American people, especially for the American. It's not just ideology, although, that's the large movement of ideas, let us say. Theory and philosophy are also very important, and this new understanding of Du Bois and the theory which emerges out of this new understanding, which makes all of the BS, in a certain sense, embarrassing, but also I know I feel it's abusive to trivialize a great thinker of this magnitude in a way you would never do that to Kant or Sartre or Marx. But you can claim to be, into Du Bois and still trivialize him. But I think we're on the cusp of something, like we've always said, we need more theory and better theory for a time like this. I'll just end on this. I was so moved by how engaged ordinary people were. I was so happy it wasn't it wasn't going to be a bunch of academics, no matter what. They're too quote too busy. They know to But anyway, it was ordinary people who asked questions, who felt that new knowledge and necessary knowledge was being constructed. That was the thing that I felt so moved by, not to mention Nuri's smile. The only thing that makes Nuri smile after doing a day of classes at the University of Pennsylvania is when we start talking about philosophy. I saw the transformation, Nuri, because the smile was so big and you didn't stop it. So I'll stop there. And of course, Jerry, I think we're all on the same vibe these days.
We're on your vibe.
No, I think y'all, because philosophy, do y'all talk about philosophy at home?
What do you think?
I was just wondering.
It's the meeting, you get it.
Well, I'll stop. You don't have to answer that question. I know I'm getting personal. I'm finished, Benedict.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, just thinking of where to begin because I think you're touching on a lot of, when the Trump administration.
Oh, by the way,
Yeah.
excuse, I think Shantanu is an essay that he wanted to.
What? Oh, right.
I'm sorry, Sindor.
Oh no, I think just to add, I think I was talking to talk yesterday about the kind of panic that is in news media nowadays about Europe in particular, about how the steps that the Trump administration has been taking is a big cause for concern for particularly Europe. It has been relegated to a position of irrelevance almost, and I think I was talking to Doc about this article that I was reading by this Singaporean diplomat called Kishore Mahbubani, and I think that his take is one that I have not seen very often in news nowadays, where there are so many articles about how Europe should feel threatened by Trump. Instead, what his argument is that Europe should actually look at this as a path forward for itself in this moment where Trump meeting Putin to end the Ukraine war without consulting the European leaders, even though if you look at it, their strategic interests are in question, points towards this irrelevance that the European Union and Britain have on the world stage currently. And so Mahbubani's argument is that Europe has to think about three options which would restore Europe's geopolitical standing. And he calls them three unthinkable options, which for the last 75 years Europe has never ever considered to be a remote possibility. One being to quit NATO. And if Europe quits NATO, then that would be the end of NATO. And we're actually moving towards a world where NATO would end one way or the other. And so I think his point is that Europe should quit NATO. Europe, if Trump's insistence that the European Union increase its defense budget to 5% of its GDP, which would amount to about $1.1 billion, that would exceed the
I think
amount.
trillion, is it? 1.1 trillion.
$1.1 trillion. Yeah, that makes more sense. That actually is more than the $820 billion that the US allocates to its defense budget, and so it would not need US aid anymore, and would also be able to probably rejuvenate its economy. The second would be to seek a strategic bargain with Russia, which it has not done. And again, because the US has historically not tried to seek a detente with Russia till this point. And, looking at Europe's geopolitical position in the world, the fact that Europe is closer to Russia than it is to the US points towards the fact that it would be actually extremely beneficial for them if they did do the strategic bargain with Russia. And Mahubani actually says that Europe has to stop thinking of Russia as its political rival or a threat to its security, because he calls Russia geopolitical realists and of the highest order, and the fact that Russia at this point would not be interested in quote unquote global dominance or anything like that. They would be happy to make this peaceful relationship with the EU, given that their core strategic interests on both sides are not harmed in any way. And the third thing would be to make a strategic compact with China. So these are the three things that the Europeans have historically never wanted to do: seek good relations with Russia, China, and quit NATO. So I think that his point was that in order for Europe to declare that Europe will now be an autonomous geopolitical player or an actor on the world stage, which is what the US is trying to do, they would have to do this. They would have to also, like Trump, accept or recognize and acknowledge multipolarity. And I think this is the language he used, that not and stop licking the feet of the people who kicks them in their face. Of course, talking about the US at this point, and not in a bad way. I think that he says that Trump is acting like a rational geopolitical actor, where he has put the interests of America and the American people before the interests of Europe or other countries in the world, and Europe would do good to also follow his example, and maybe then America and Trump and J.D. Vance will actually start respecting Europe for their position in the world.
Can I just say one quick thing? You all probably saw this. We didn't mention the Zelensky-Trump feud.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And what's that commentator's name that we were talking about yesterday?
Ben Norton?
No. Oh, not Norton. The other one. Alexander Karen.
Oh, Kramer.
Alexander Kramer?
Yeah. Yes. He said that.
Zelensky has to.
Yeah, Zelensky to save his life, he would do best to surrender to the Russians and reveal all of the secrets because he's a spent force, and the West will ultimately get rid of him, and that he would be safer in the hands of the Russians than with the West. And Mahbubani was the Prime Minister of Singapore. Is that?
He was a Singaporean diplomat. He writes for, I think, the foreign policy.
Yeah. And just the Ben Norton thing, Ben Norton is one of these talk a mile a minute, so-called geostrategists, who was arguing that all of this movement toward in Ukraine, it's not about peace in Ukraine, it's all about China. It's all about China. And I get this from some other podcasters on the so-called far left or lunatic left, who see all of this as nothing has changed. It's still the neocons in charge. That there's nothing to celebrate or to be encouraged in this movement towards peace, and against NATO, frankly, that they're just doing this. The oligarchs are doing this because they want to focus on China.
Yeah, I think he also talks about how Trump's move towards Russia is an attempt. I think he mentions this, that it's an attempt to enforce a Sino-Russia split.
Yes.
And which also makes little sense, just given the geography, because when I think of geopolitics, it's geography and politics. You also have to consider the geography, and I keep thinking about how China and Russia are neighbors, and they, I think, share the longest border and everything, and so it would make very little sense for them to antagonize their neighbor in order to make some kind of to get some political dividends from the US across the Pacific.
Because I feel like there was obviously some Soviet split during the Cold War, which the US was involved with like Kissinger and all those people. But I agree that also it's a new moment for humanity. America is not in the place that it was during the height of the Cold War. Russia and China are each not in the same place that they were during the Cold War. And I think, I've also seen like Chinese commentary on this whole question of like, oh, is Trump trying to manufacture a new Sino-Russia split? And actually, like, I was reading an article actually this morning from on like the China Academy, which is that website that publishes stuff. But
what website is it?
It's called the China Academy. That's also where they actually published one of the interviews with the DeepSeek founder. But like, part of it is that one, America is not nearly as powerful during the Cold War, and also the nature of the Russia-China relationship is different from what it was during the Cold War as well. In which I feel like maybe you can also correct this or add more, but my understanding is that a lot of even what was driving the Sino-Soviet split was ideological questions.
Yeah,
and obviously there's also geopolitical stuff, there's economic stuff involved. But the nature of the Russia-China relationship today is, in some ways, even if it's not based off of like a single ideology in the way that it was, in some ways it actually makes it much more robust in a way, or much more durable, because it's not so brittle of like, oh, like we think that Marxism means one thing and you think Marxism means another thing, and therefore we're going to have like this clash. And it's much more like an actual strategic partnership, I think. And I don't think that the Chinese are actually very scared at all about, even if Trump is able to achieve rapprochement with Russia, and even if I do think that there are people in the Trump administration who would like to basically pivot away from Russia towards great power competition with China. But I don't think that the Chinese themselves are actually that worried about it, because they actually know the nature of the Russia-China relationship, which I guess also Joe has brought this up as well in past weeks. But I just want to add that, because I do think that that's like it's a kind of, maybe it's an epistemological question too, of like, is everything just a repeat of the past? Or even if there are things which may bear resemblance to, you know, past periods of history, what is actually new about it? What has actually changed? And is this, like, what can you actually understand about the world in a new moment, even if there are things which repeat? Because I think even this question of, yeah, like, I think the primary way that I think a lot of Western commentators are interpreting it is that Trump is leaning into this notion of, yeah, like, great power competition and great power conflict, in which, yeah, like, this is also one way to even interpret the concept of multipolarity, in which it's just like another age of like great power competition, similar to what basically started World War One. But also, I feel like what's different about it is actually like, instead of like, let's say during the 19th and 20th century, in which great power conflict was between different European countries, like what we're actually dealing with now is an actual new age of intercivilizational relationships, which I feel like is actually, to me, that seems to me to be a better way of understanding even what multipolarity means, because it's not just like centers of power in a kind of neutral sense, but actual like different civilizations and not just the West kind of competing within itself. And I think that's like even, yeah, like what we mean by like, what is the new moment for humanity? And what does it mean that it's like, even if there are quote unquote great powers, like obviously, yeah, like Russia, China, the US, for instance, the most like nuclear stockpile, which is part of what you would even mean by like, yeah, like a superpower. Like they have a certain economic impact on the world. But even deeper beyond that, like I do think it matters that we're dealing with like multiple civilizations actually having to exist with each other and have a relationship with each other, which Trump in his own way, he has his own way of talking about it, but in some ways he is a reflection of some kind of recognition of like a new actual intercivilizational period for humanity. Because I think like that is part of what I've been like trying to grapple with is, yeah, like I think in free school also many times it's like we're always shifting, like, okay, like you can look at the world one way, there's another way of analyzing the world. It's like always different kind of layers of analysis that I think we're trying to kind of synthesize all the time. But I think like part of what is like important, like you said, is the free school, even if we're trying to work these ideas out, but we do stand on the side on this piece. And that is always the side that we take. And if, like, let's say, yeah, like Trump wants to basically pivot away from Russia to, I don't even know if he wants to wage war with China to begin with. Like, actually, the way that he talks about it is usually much more economic competition with China, which is different from actually trying to wage war with China. But even if that's the case, like, could the Trump administration even achieve what it thinks that it wants to achieve against China to begin with? Or has the nature of the world power, the nature of the actual nature of the balance of power, has that changed so fundamentally that even Trump, no matter what he wants to do, like, and this also, I think this gets to like what we talked about last week with like the whole Gaza stuff, because I think like it is genuinely like, to me, it's like genuinely morally disturbing.
Yes.
To be like, yeah, like I want to like ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, and I want to build like casinos there and all that stuff, which Trump says. But I think even like actually this week, like in a press conference, Trump was like, oh, like actually, I was surprised because like Egypt and Jordan didn't accept my proposal to cleanse out the Gaza Strip, and they put forward their own proposal. And he's like, no, I'm not going to impose what my plan is. And like, you know, like you don't always have to take Trump at his word when he says stuff, because he is kind of like part of his whole strategy is to like say shit all the time. But at the same time, it's like I do think Trump in his own way recognizes that like, yeah, like maybe he would want to actually try to impose a plan. But on the other hand, I think, especially with this whole Russia thing, I think there is a deeper, maybe either conscious or subconscious recognition of like, no, like the US can't simply do whatever it wants to. And I think, yeah, part of the difficulty is that like even in this whole Trump phenomenon, like there's so many things happening all the time, and there's so many different moving pieces and different players with their own agendas. Like Elon has his own agenda, Trump has his own agenda, and like all these different players, and like even like Steve Bannon, like we were talking about. And so it is difficult to make sense of all of it, and like you have to kind of pick and choose. Like, okay, like what's important, what is signal, and what is noise. Like where's the actual current of world events moving, which is not something which can be totally even dictated by Trump alone. and it has to actually involve like an accounting for where is world humanity moving, and like aside from even what America can impose on the rest of the world, like yeah, where is world humanity moving? So yeah, and I also wanted to bring up, I guess related to Du Bois, it reminded me of in 1949, Du Bois, I think, was one of like the sole voices in America who opposed the creation of NATO. And he actually gave this
1949.
1949. So he gives this speech in front of Congress, basically opposing the U.S. funding of the creation of NATO, which we have. We republished it on the Avant-Garde's website, which I encourage people to go back and read because it's a really good speech. And yeah, I think in part it's like Du Bois is like dealing with this whole thing, which I feel like we've been dealing with, which is that the U.S. ruling elite will always say like, "Oh, this is for peace." Like we're doing all this stuff for war, but it's for peace, and like Du Bois immediately picks up on it because yeah, like the whole notion is that NATO is a quote unquote defensive pact. Because it's also I feel like when even like the U.S. itself changes what used to be the Department of War to the Department of Defense, you know, and like that even that semantic change is like, oh no, like we're not a war-making nation, we're a defensive nation. NATO is a defensive pact. So yeah, like tell that to like Serbia, like tell that to all these places in the world that NATO have, like tell that to Libya, for example.
Right.
But I think yeah, like Trump or Du Bois is like dealing with in real time this question of yeah, like how is the U.S. ruling class adjusting? How does it see its like world vision and basically NATO as an instrument for what he sees as yeah, like a third world war. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think yeah, like Du Bois in many ways, like you said on Thursday. Like Du Bois initiated a new world movement of thought.
I think so.
Yeah.
Is that a credit?
No, I think so. And I think that part of the task is that we're still in the period of completing, of attempting to complete and to bring forward and to bring to life like that new moment of thought which he starts in the history of humanity. Which is yeah, I think why it clarifies for me like why we're doing it. Yeah.
I also, in the same lines of what Jeremiah was saying, I think this in the reading group at the Lucian Blackwell Library, the essay that was being read last time was "Dangerous Road" before Martin Luther King. And then there's that one line that I think we also talked about in the reading group, but I'm thinking about a lot now, where Baldwin is saying, in his efforts to talk about King and understand what kind of revolutionary he was and how he was produced, he says that this is all in retrospect, so it's easier to understand in some ways how to analyze somebody like King or how to even understand some of the struggles that he had to go through within himself to become who he became. And I'm feeling like today's conversation is reminding me so much that is the task that we are struggling with right now. How do you make sense of the moment in the moment, you know?
Right.
And how do you
Make sense of the moment.
in the moment? And I feel like this sounds like a simple thing to state, but it's not that simple. Simply because of what you started with, Doc, you know, with all the attacks, but just how difficult or constrained thought and discourse has become. So you're right, like honestly, when trying to decide whether what Trump is doing with Ukraine is moral or immoral, right or wrong, the question of why Russia invaded Ukraine to begin with, how can that not be a factor? And it is not often enough. And it's not remembered, you know, what those back and forths between Putin trying to come close to the West, but being told that, yes, you can, but on our terms. What, like, all of that does not play into when you finally sit down to try and assess what is actually happening. And even the thing about fascism, and it reminded me of something that had come up in the science conference. Like today, I think you said the post-Cold War imperial order or neo-colonial order, like rested on how strong the American dollar and the military could be. But at the science conference, we had also talked about the university. We talked about academia and ideological control or control of narratives. And yeah, I mean, I was trying to sort of relate that to what you were saying about Du Bois and what you said in the lecture, which I guess is available. Everybody should look at it. This idea that to do science or to do research or to seek knowledge in a time of crisis, like particularly to this thing of being able to assess something while it's happening so that you can produce something useful, you have to be more open in your methods than just, the empirical method, where poetry and philosophy and all of this become a part of it. Because one thing that I was thinking about, which I think you said in some way, I don't remember exactly how you said it, that for Du Bois, peace and freedom were assumptions of even why he was doing what he was doing, as opposed to what may be standard nowadays is to try and talk about, okay, no, people should behave this way, and maybe one of the outcomes of that would be peace and freedom. Like what does it mean to make peace, freedom, and the broadest growth or the broadest I don't know, flowering of the human being as an assumption of how you see the world or how you do science or how you do theory and any of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. But I think I think this question of whether history repeats or whether what stays the same versus what changes is kind of an interesting in some ways, because I think it's very tempting, to say maybe we're repeating a certain moment of if Trump proposes a trilateral summit, is it going to be like FDR Churchill meeting? Are we going back to an era of war, like fascism? But I think then the question that it makes me ask is epistemologically, do you think history is a form of destiny where the forms are already decided and people simply converge, or basically we're pushed into a moment? Or does consciousness actually play a role in history of what people think is possible, what people choose to believe and also to move towards? Because I think a lot of what we get from Du Bois is, I think, this idea of human capacity or agency, law and chance. But then what I've realized, or have been thinking about the last few weeks, is how much our choices are basically grounded in an epistemology. Our choices are also grounded in basically epistemology of what you think reality even is, of what you think the possibilities are, and what you, think that you actually know. And so I feel epistemology in some ways defines what you think is destiny or what just is versus what can be. And I guess I say that because even in this frame of great power competition, I guess part of the question is, do you believe that humankind or that people have learned from the experiences of the 19th and the 20th centuries? Do you believe that maybe people have learned from those experiences and don't want to just repeat it mindlessly? We don't need to do World War II again. We don't want to do it again.
Why would China want to do World War II?
Yeah, why would China want to do another Sino-Soviet split in the exact same way? I feel to say that is to, in some ways, belittle the capacity of human beings to even want better. And I think to also believe that consciousness does not have a place in the unfolding of human history. Because I feel when we were reading Hegel, actually the development of human consciousness and the development of new thought, but also that was really tied to the struggle for freedom. And so I feel that, I think what we're talking about with epistemology actually is really important, and even freeing the capacity of people to act. And I think also this question of reality is interesting, because what we're saying is that the fact is that people may have a certain ideology or certain ideological assumptions based on their epistemology. But the fact is that we all act in the same reality, and your actions have consequences. And in some ways, actions having consequences offer an opportunity to revise your epistemology or actually develop a new sense of, this is how I know what I know. And it's because it's been tested by reality. And so I think this idea of building a science or knowing what moment you're in while you're in it, I think actually it fundamentally requires the scientific approach. And I think it relates in some ways to what we were saying, which is that Trump lives in reality, where any figure in the world, any person who's a part of history may have certain desires or certain goals or like things that they think maybe they have a mandate for or is possible. But in the end, like you're met up with the resistance or the response of other people. And I feel like in some ways that is one process, like it's one democratic process of every person like asserting their will, like defining their agency. And basically, I think it's also like what we were talking about with like, I don't know, like the dialectical struggle or like the struggle of ideas between like people, like even in free school, which is that we all come to the table with like our assumptions, but then we tell each other things and we have to actually learn from what's happening. And yeah, in some ways, I think what you were saying too, which is that it's the question of world humanity and the US has a place in that, but like the US can't just impose its will anymore because like we're in like a reality of the world. And so I think just that this thing of like a recognition of democracy in a new form and it being really tied to like human consciousness. And that consciousness is like an essential part of the democratic capacity.
Yeah, because I think just one thing I wanted to add was whether it's the lecture that you gave on Thursday, the Lucian Blackwell reading group, or every week when we meet for free school and all the events that we do, I do think that like I've become much more convinced of what you were saying, which is that ordinary people are ready to engage in the struggle of ideas and also to engage in the struggle to create new knowledge. And this is happening all the time. It's happening all the time in the Lucian Blackwell reading group. We're creating new knowledge and we're not just confirming things which we already think we know. And I think part of the necessity of that process is, like you were saying, in order for that creation to happen, it is necessary for people to actually still be very open about what their assumptions are and like what they're actually bringing to the table. Because I think this is something that I've also realized, but part of the difficulty of doing anything in America is that people are socialized to lie to each other so much, and without even realizing it all the time. But it's like you're lying constantly in order to basically get by. And part of what is needed is like people need to be open with each other. And it's like not every people bring different assumptions, they bring different epistemology into it. And like in order for there to be the achievement of a realization of like truth, of getting closer to reality, like you actually need to be like, okay, like what are your assumptions? And like these are my assumptions, and like let's actually work through it. And I think part of this is that, like, I guess my question is, what we're talking about, what we're trying to do in free school and like all these different avenues is like almost like a kind of renaissance of ideas. Is this something which is necessary for democracy itself, or for the achievement of a new democracy, in which the people take upon themselves all of these questions, of like ideas, of knowledge, of the struggle over ideas, and the struggle over knowledge? Like, is this a necessary condition for the achievement of a new democracy amongst the American people?
Are you asking me?
I don't know. So open question.
Oh, yeah.
I want to say what Nuri, what you were talking about the epistemology. I think you're onto something because Karl Marx said that your consciousness is determined by your social existence, and we're at a time in history when our social existence is being challenged, and you can see how and what Jeremiah was talking about, how the world is changing globally. And I was thinking what Tony was talking about, how Russia, when the Cold War, how we used to think of Russia communism. That's how we were brought up, and that's no longer the case now. The way we think of capitalism has changed. The way we think of communism has changed, and question of war. Technology, like that's changed the whole pattern of war. People don't want to go to war. So we have to think of new ways the old, as Tony was saying, those foreign policy ways that we had before, in some ways, Trump is bringing in new ways of thinking about foreign policy. But that old way of thinking does not work with today's conditions. And these are all questions that, and so, you use the term interregnum, things like that. It's kind of like a break in history. And it's manifesting itself. You see it in the world. And so I think that you are onto something quite significant.
I would also just add to it is today morning I was just reading news and I was also marveling that this really had to happen. Like, this whole thing of what role the US plays in the world. I think I can imagine a few different ways it would have gone, how that question would have been.
Say that once again, how?
There are a few different ways how that question could have been determined, the US role in the world, where there could have been overwhelming external pressure making the US. But it's significant that it is something that's happening through the will of the American people, like this election of Trump, this defeat of what we call the liberal consensus and so on. And I guess the question that's put on the table now is, I mean, last week we said this is what King was talking about in his Beyond Vietnam speech. What Trump is saying he'd do with denuclearization and, reduction, like basically slashing the military budget by half. This is what the Black Freedom Movement was talking about. This is what King was talking about. But what else, what other ingredients are needed right now to complete that revolution of values? Because it is in some ways influenced by what was started in the 60s, but how do you complete it?
Well, I wanted to say that, yeah, from what you're saying or from what everyone else is saying, it's true that what is currently being challenged and upended, the post World War II state, there has been a lot of ideological there's a lot of investment in that, and therefore when we talk about the reason, I guess, you're talking about the Trump administration and war in Europe and what all of this means is to really say that the American people, first of all, have a right to study the world on their own terms, and to study this question, to study war, to study the role of in the US, in its war on the world's people. There has been severe ideological consensus that has been built, and therefore when we talk about Trump and just going on from what we have been trying to do for the last few weeks, I think it was very clear what you were saying, that this is a question that we first have to state that we have a right to ask this question, and we can't look at it simply in terms. This is not simply a question of. It's not simply a question of knowing what Trump's foreign policy is, but this is really the basis of how we understand this time. And what you're saying about a new ideological movement, the fact that the world has changed, the ideological relationship between, I guess, this is what the geopoliticians would talk about. But yeah, the ideological relationships of the world also have an impact on ideological relationships in society and how we relate to each other. And this is why I think this question of we start to ask the question of, okay, does Trump look at China in, is it a question of pivoting towards war on China, or is it economic competition and so on? This is always going to be, I feel like the way this question is posed is sort of to try to weigh between, is Trump better or worse than previous administrations and so on. And I think I'm beginning to think that it's not even a useful question, because we're trying to really see that, okay, this time actually has new possibilities for the American people to understand the world. And also what you were saying about how the US state it's now clear that the US state has been an enemy of the world's people. And maybe this moment is probably the coming together of American people with the world. And I think this is very significant because this is significant because it has, I think we have, like in the world, people have also been denied any knowledge of the American people because you don't you don't think of the American people at all in the or like for the rest of the world you think of the American people as like something that's just like you think of it in terms of the state, and therefore to see the beauty of what the American people have been able to achieve or what they can achieve today. I think it's significant for the world. But this requires this study. This requires study of the American people and of the question of war and peace. That's what I wanted to say. And also I guess what you're saying about the need for a new science, what like Muri was also saying, and why need for a new science, and really what Du Bois was doing. I think what you're saying about how target humanity could not be studied by sociology, I think that's very significant because we still have the same question of the question of like forward movement of ideas and the forward movement of science is something that's imperative for this time, and it's because we are faced, like the question that I think we have often been trying to talk about this also is like what exactly do we mean when we talk about epistemology? We're talking about a set of shared assumptions, but it's more than just assumptions. It's about a framework of thought, and we're also, like I guess the epistemology that sustains the ruling class has been this attitude that humanity cannot be studied, like to study humanity would reveal the fact that darker races are human beings, so therefore that's what the attitude has been. And I think now what we're finding out is that like the American people are at a place where they are asking this question. They're responding to this question of, it's the consequence of a severe crisis of legitimacy of narratives. When, yes, our sense of the world does not correlate. It does not have any bearing on how we see the world. So therefore, the need for a new way of thought. Yeah. So I mean, this is. I think it's very significant that we ask this question of epistemology, because this is not simply out of an academic curiosity or philosophy, or just trying to figure out a philosophical way of talking about something, but this is what really the people are asking.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I'm trying to catch up because this week, I think free school, especially because of the year of Baldwin, we've been heading in a direction that I think is like both. I mean, obviously, I think also the world has changed a lot in just a few weeks, and in America, things have changed a lot in just a few weeks. But also, I think free school, I think the year of Baldwin and what essentially was us successfully getting closer to the people was really important to us. And I feel really sad I missed the talk on Thursday because I think there is something very significant about Du Bois and the framing you laid out, Doc, of in some ways, the American people today, especially with the world changing as it is and America changing as it is, and everything with Trump and the fact that there might even likely be a summit between Trump, Putin, and Xi. Like, who would think that? Like, those three together sets the American people up in such a good position to pick Du Bois back up. I don't know. I was really impacted by what you said, Doc, about how it wasn't until you can't underestimate how much Du Bois was basically buried and not just Du Bois the man, but the beginnings of this a movement of thought, and not just for world humanity, but for the American people. And yeah, I was impacted by that, and then also the way you said that, like, what we can conclude about the American people today is, one, that the American people are tired of war,
Yeah.
and two is that an attack on the state actually resonates with the American people. And that kind of impacted me, like combining this thing of Du Bois and like how even us as free school, like it's a time for us to take seriously Du Bois as not just Du Bois the man, Du Bois the thinker, but Du Bois the founder of this new movement of thought for the American people. Because yeah, what Neri said about, like, when she brought up epistemology, and like basically in some ways I feel like Neri's kind of asking the question of, well, we're in this special moment, and looking forward, like what is democracy, for example, but also what would the people need to achieve or even participate in democracy, like both participate in the process of democracy but also achieve democracy. And like she was connecting it to epistemology and consciousness. And I think I was thinking similarly, because like the reason why I think Du Bois is the founder of New Movement of Thought is so important is because, like, I think we ourselves in free school, you revisit Du Bois all the time, and you almost gain much more depending on how time is changing and what's happening in the world. And I feel like I've just been really impacted as like because we've been reading the Philadelphia Negro, and we've been just reading like Dusk of Dawn and just thinking about Du Bois a lot. That, like, I think to me, it's even like it kind of gives you shivers a little bit to even just think about the fact that here you have Du Bois, who, like Shimbarto, said it again, what you said, Doc, that Du Bois with the Philadelphia Negro was studying Black people in Philadelphia in a time when people believed that Black people could not be studied through sociology, because the assumption was Black people were not yet human and had not yet achieved society or could participate in society. And I think that's significant because, like, we say this, but like I'll say it again. We said it a lot when we're talking about Black Reconstruction, but I think to be able to say that about Black people is also saying something about humanity as a whole. Like, I think it's like, I think even this thing of like Howard Thurman, like Jesus and the Disinherited, it's almost like you're creating this new category of seeing the world where by understanding Black people, you understand something about the condition or the state of humanity too, like the disinherited. Because when you read Du Bois, to even say that, like, well, Black people can be studied through sociology, I feel like for me, like, I feel like through Du Bois's work, you hear Du Bois also saying, like, it's the belief that the mud, the peasant, the proletariat, the worker is worthy, not just worthy of study, but it is the creator of civilization itself. Like, he says that in Black Reconstruction a lot, where he was like until you recognize like the Black proletariat's contribution, then you will never believe that the worker, the lowest of the low, is the like producer of history, the producer of civilization. And I think some of these assumptions we in free school carry, but like I feel like maybe for me, I feel like it's been important to figure out what are the things beneath, what are the foundations of essentially this new movement of philosophy, new movement of thought that Du Bois founded, that I think is some ways is kind of like an earth-shattering contribution of framework. And I think it's important because, coming back to what I feel like was Nuri's question that she didn't ask, but like I felt like she was asking was, well, how do people participate in democracy in this time? Like, which is the task. How do people achieve democracy, achieve peace? Is like, I always think about it as the question of, well, how do you make a way for the people?
Right.
And making a way is not physically putting people in the same room. Like, because I feel like I'm also shaped by this past week. Like, I spent 3 days with nursing home workers as part of my job, and like you really get diverse. Like, you get people from Erie, from all parts of the state, central Pennsylvania, which is like very much like no man's land in a lot of ways. It's very rural. You get people from the Southwest, the Northwest, from Northeast, Southeast, like in Philly. You get Black, you get white, and that's basically it. You get a lot of Black people and a lot of white people, and you get some Latinos. And actually, like, and then later I then went to a strike in Northeast Pennsylvania, which was nurses. So like more highly paid nurses. And there's just a qualitative difference in them as people. And I think the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, like, I think how you make a way for people is not about putting them in the same place. It's something like, I guess you could call it epistemology, but I guess I would just say it's something philosophical. Making a way is about helping shape thought, if that makes sense. Like helping raise or bring out, like making a way for people to actually be able to see each other. You know, this whole thing of like, they already know each other, but they just don't know that they know each other yet. Like these nursing home workers, like, they just feel you really get the belief, like seeing these nursing home workers reminded me of the way, like when I spent a week in India, like the way you would travel through the countryside and see basically like the Indian peasantry, like very poor people, like poor Indian peasants. And you really get the sense of like, these are the people who made civilization, and these are the people who like invented peanut butter. Like, you know, like these are the people who, like, it's the way that King in that one speech says, like, out of an illiterate people who were slaves, you had the first scientist who invented peanut butter, and you have the first poet, you have Count Cullen, you have like Paul Laurence Dunbar, you had Marian Anderson, you produced like basically civilization. And how do you make a way for like these nursing home workers to see that like you are the mud that creates civilization? And like in some ways people feel like they're already there. It's just that they don't have the way yet. You know, like it's something philosophic, theoretical, I don't know. And I wanted to say that because some people would say that unity or like making a way, people coming together is based upon class. But if it was based upon class in of itself, like, you know, classical ways of viewing class, like wage, you know, categories of wages, categories of, you know, technically nurses are the somewhat, you know, they make a little bit more, but like they are the same class as these nursing home workers. But what makes them so different? And like, this is more of a question, like I don't have the answers, but something that I do think you find in Du Bois, and I think it's something that we have to build upon, which is the question of like, what is important? What is actually important? Like, what would actually constitute people from here on out? Like, is it memory? Like you brought up last week, how much of it is memory? You could live through it, but you may not have memory of it. Like, so how much of it is that you lived through it versus how much of it is a memory? How much of it is like, it's an interesting question, like historical constitution versus also like memory, or like Mary brought up the word consciousness. And yes, I feel like those are the questions being raised. Like, how do you determine, like, for me, I'm like, well, why? It's an instinct, but I would like to actually know why I think this way. Like, why is it that I feel like these nurses, you know, they're all different to a certain degree, but why is it I feel like some people, even if they voted for Trump, for example, they still are ready to take the system as it is to a certain extent, co-opt what they can. And then why is it that I feel like a totally other people all are ready to like extremely skeptical and are ready to like move on from whatever they thought was theirs. Like they're ready for the new. They're right there, and they're already like there. So yeah, that's what your introduction made me think about. Oh, and the last thing is, I don't know, because I didn't hear the talk on Thursday, but I'll listen to the video. When that quote that you said Du Bois had, which is his definition of sociology, like I will take to put together science and philosophy.
Philosophy and history.
Philosophy and history, and its unity is sociology.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty important. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we should go back to that. But here I agree with you completely that to reduce the struggle of humanity to economic class as though people live in economic boxes, I think is a huge mistake, and you cannot see the way forward, and you cannot convince, people of the way forward. You're right. I think, let me say, I think that the ideological part of the struggle for freedom is more powerful and more necessary now than ever. And I agree with Nuri and Jerry about this. You see it all around us, that people are struggling with ideas, etc.
About the question that was asked on Thursday when somebody asked, like, is there a successor to Du Bois? Like somebody who actually continued or like furthered or helped complete this world movement of thought that he initiated. And I was thinking about it a lot because I think first what impressed me was how open or how readily people wanted, like accepted Du Bois as like, yes, like this world leader, like somebody who started. Like that premise was not like something to fight over. And I feel like I appreciated that because sometimes I think it was just really clear that the orientation of like the people overall who came to that was like, yeah, I'm here not for like academic bickering, but I'm here because actually like I want to know and I want the world to be better. And I feel like if that's like your overall inclination, then it's very like probable that there is like there are leaders of thought, or that there are people who did things that we don't know about, but you want to know about. But also, I think when you answered, I think you left it pretty open, and you're like, oh, I don't know if there is like a successor in that way. And I was thinking about it, and I think in some ways it's because the task is actually for the people to now take that, like basically to accept the premise that something has been started, but it's not going to be finished at this point by any one person or any like lead or any figure like that. It's different. And it even made me think more about like Du Bois's formulation of Da Vinci as the founder of modern science. And I was thinking about it because basically he says, no, Da Vinci is like not just a forerunner, but actually he matters because he like preceded an age of science. Like Francis Bacon was doing it in an age of science when actually like all of humanity or like many, like it was common, like the consciousness of the time was at a level where science was a common like approach in some ways.
Yes.
Like it wasn't something that belonged to one person or like something fighting against the era. Like for Francis Bacon, like it was a time, like I think in the essay he says like any like idea could have set the world, like something like that. But I say that because like thinking about the distance from the time that Du Bois lived also to now, I feel like we would say that there was a great advancement in consciousness of the world, like even like literacy rates becoming like much higher, like people actually knowing of a world like beyond their villages, like coming to know each other in a new way. And I feel like in some ways like this thing of the democratic struggle is also not to say that individual figures aren't important, because they are, but that today like really what is needed is like a mass like struggle of all people, like all humanity at a much higher level than has been produced up to this point. And because at first I was like, oh, like I guess in some ways like you could make the argument that like maybe Baldwin is a successor to Du Bois, but like when we were talking about like the Baldwin Du Bois, like all of that, and I was like, well, maybe you wouldn't say that because we're talking about science right now, like really like sociology, science, and honing in on that. And then also I was like, well, you could also say that in some ways the free school tries to be the inheritor of Du Bois, but I feel like when we're talking about a successor, it's that actually like we're not the only ones who like hope to inherit Du Bois, but actually that the whole American people or even the whole world. And we don't know really like where it will come or where exactly it will go. I just had the feeling that like when we're talking about Du Bois, initiating a world movement of thought, like that task is really something for right now.
I just thought that the question of successor was not a good question, and it showed to me, at least I felt, that the people who put it that way didn't really understand what we were trying to get, only partially understood.
Treating it as like an academic lineage.
Yeah. And especially when the woman said Kimberly Crenshaw. I said, wow. But you know, it's a failure of academic education.
Yeah, because I think also like what I really got is that even the argument, of why Da Vinci is the founder of modern science is not one of academic chronology to say like this person invented it and then this person took it up. But I feel like it is a question of like history and then consciousness for the time.
That's right. And see, Du Bois says experimental science, you know, which I thought was a key, which is science separated from natural science. You know, the old school of natural science, where everything was a philosophical discussion.
Right.
What he says Leonardo did is to begin experimental science, that is empirical science. And Shantanu and I were discussing this yesterday. I sent out something about a short, but I thought very good documentary on the Vienna School. Did you get it?
No, you exclude.
Okay, I think you were in China at the time.
Can't use China for everything.
But you know, the Copenhagen conference in the mid 1920s and the Vienna Circle arise about the same time, and they represent two philosophical or epistemological trends in philosophy, a philosophy of science, and but what I wanted to say is, I think philosophy and science lost their ways in the 20th century. So, and therefore, it was of great significance that Du Bois returns science to its roots in Leonardo. That was a hell of a move on it to be 22 even. I mean, God, put you to shame. But I think this is something we're trying to work through, the problem of Kant, the problem of British empiricism. But Du Bois is epistemologically one of the ways out of the trap of empiricism, or even Kantianism, this uniting of science and experimental science with art. And this is something I think, you know, we're still trying to work out. But it is, I think, I see it as a profound move on the part of Du Bois. And something, the Vienna Circle, which is logical positivism, or string theory, or AI and chips and all of that. I just think there's so much that is rich right there. And there does not have to be a successor as much as a recognition and further exploration of what this means. What does this mean?
Well, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, please.
Well, maybe I sometimes I think I don't take AI and chips seriously enough. Or even like when what you're saying about the schools of thought, like the way out of Kantian and British empiricism would be a uniting of science with art. Like I guess the way because when you brought up the Du Bois and the new movement of thought, I also I did connect it to Du Bois as also this new movement of thought being very important to even see that all humanity struggle for peace and democracy
Yes,
today.
no, there's no question.
Like, and
There is no.
because in some ways, like hearing you say this makes me think, like I really feel like, for example, King and Gandhi are two examples of, like King in particular, I'd say, like, but I would even put Gandhi in there too. But
Yes,
in
yes.
some ways, you could say that King, like even when he honors Du Bois with like honoring Dr. Du Bois on like Du Bois' centenary,
Yes.
and when King explains it, in some ways, King is basically saying, I owe a lot to Du Bois, the way Du Bois in some ways claims science again. Not just history, but science, thought, philosophy. Where in some ways I feel like you could see King and Gandhi as creating movement using Du Boisian science or like a new movement of thought for like like something about that framework or bringing back a certain scientific approach to
if you and maybe we should spend some time reading that essay.
Yeah.
Because one of the things he says is that it's very difficult to pinpoint the origins of great movements of world thought. And when I use it, I got it right from him. The movement of world thought. That wasn't me. I know you can. So I may as well fess up. But you remember where he says it's difficult to pinpoint the origin
That's interesting.
and the particular individual. But
well, because
yes.
well, the reason why I connect is when you explained experimental science versus natural science.
Natural philosophy.
Natural philosophy. Yeah, the importance because well, I'm getting this from a recap of your talk from I think Alex. But like I think you probably mentioned, because I haven't seen the video, but you mentioned like that, for example, even with the Philadelphia Negro, it is both philosophical and experimental science. Like I don't know, it's both. It's,
yeah. See this thing. What I was trying to do with Philadelphia Negro, and is first of all, you read even his dissertation, "A Suppression of the African Slave Trade." You feel something poetic, especially when he makes a number of poetic or imaginative leaps. Chapter 7, he's talking about the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. And, much of that movement is in England, and, Methodists were part of it, John Wesley and Wilberforce, to get the English to opt out of the slave trade, which they did by 1804. However, Du Bois said the suppression of the Africans, 1638 to 1870. So he always has, this is another thing, a kind of chronology that is radically different. Well, the slave trade was ended in 1804, and slavery was ended by 1865. Well, what you mean 1638 to 1870? I mean, it's a whole, different way of looking at events and the world. But when he goes to the Haitian Revolution, and then, to Toussaint Louverture as a site of the struggle to end the transatlantic slave trade, this is completely new, unusual, and some people would say crazy, because how could Black people end the slave trade? Wasn't it white men? Wasn't it Wilberforce? Wasn't it Wesley? And other anti-slave traders in England? And then, of course, the assumption of the time was that Black people were not human. So how? But he, in chapter 7, boom, it is so much, and this is why I associate the artistic with the imaginary, and that's why I compared it to King's, 3 dimension, the third dimension what often defined as God, the unknown, but I said it wrong in this week, the unknown, but yet knowable. And most of what, see, this is why God becomes the representative of the unknown, but knowable. And that's real deep. And I wish Albert were here because this idea of that God represents that, but that is what the artist strives for. And, so Du Bois is, and Leonardo, but I think more than this is me by where Du Bois makes even more, I won't say concrete, but realizes the epistemological implications, where he recognizes that there's a realm of the non-concrete, the unknowable, yet knowable, the unknown, but yet knowable. You know what I'm saying? And this is where, you see, where the arrogance of the physics theory and string theory, you know what I'm saying? We can know it all. No, we can't. And it will take more than theoretical physics to know. Even the highest forms of mathematics or of AI. You know something? When who was the cat that flew into town? I keep forgetting. Susskind. This is a drama that's so beautiful. Because Susskind, he was one of the kind of founders, but one of the enforcers of string theory. You couldn't get a job unless you went through him. And then when he had to admit that it failed, he gave it up like a dying gangster. Just gave it up, man. Bitter, angry. Yeah, I done fucked over all y'all. But my point is this. They went down the road of logical positivism, which ultimately became what they call the unity of science program, which meant that all science could be put under my words are bad today, put under the framework of empirical sciences, especially what physicists did. And, without getting into a lot of detail, this in some ways goes back to Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, and the idea that we could know and could clarify what was sense and what was nonsense, what was true and what was untrue. You know what I'm saying? And we would do this through creating new language. And of course, with string theory, the new language became this more sophisticated mathematical language. And as such, it took us miles and miles and years away from art. It will all not be known at once. And that's what the string, we will know it all at once. We will unify the Newtonian or relativity theory with quantum mechanics. And that, to me, if you ask me, that was the great undoing. Once art, and whatever all that means and how it is brought together in, physics theory, theoretical physics, or any other area, is still what we have to work on. It's not
Can
quite,
you repeat that?
you know, we can say science and art must be united to advance knowledge, even in the spheres of theoretical physics or whatever, evolutionary biology, because most of it we don't know. And if you take logical positivism, what they were saying is if we can get the right language, and in this case, mathematics as a language, we can, first of all, separate all the nonsense, what they call nonsense, out, and get to clear statements. One, about what we're talking about, and two, about science or scientific questions itself. And string theory was kind of the final attempt, maybe not, but one of the great attempts to use mathematics to solve all problems. But mathematics, which is not an actual language, not a human language, it is an abstraction from human languages to create logical relationships. But it is the question of art. It is the question of Leonardo. I'm sorry.
No, because I'm like, well, what is the missing piece? Like, what is the, and I feel like this conversation has been ongoing a bit this week about, and in the context of the event, bringing up experimental science and art, like, part of the issue of like postmodern art is that it's not really about anything. And like there's theoretical
I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm sorry, sir.
no.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, never mind.
Yeah,
Postmodern art.
no, it's not. It has but the theoretical, like there's a lot of theory, but like artists like, okay, what I'm concerned about is how art can produce itself, and like artists that I've been paying attention to now, in addition to Barbara Bullock, are concerned with research for the fact of like, well, there is either a people, civilization, culture, biological path, or like like systems, like or something that functions in the world that I'm interested in either a philosophical way or to investigate, to find something else as connected to, for example, either the use of spirituality, religion, as when you study it, the studying also comes into the depiction, and then the depiction also goes, and I'm talking about a process, through the depiction of what is found, you also find other things that either, you use to investigate. And I'm interested in people who do that, because an assumption in what abstract expressionism is you find the unknown without prior questions or investigations or, criteria.
Could you explain that?
Meaning, like, who's that guy that you have in your wall?
Jonathan?
No.
Michael?
The other one.
Andrew?
Wait a minute. Right next to Andrew. Like in that room. There's Andrew, and then there's your whole wall, Barbara, and then on the
Paris.
Yeah, Paris.
So Paris, Paris, when we met him a couple of times in Whole Foods, he was like, And I don't think that Paris, I don't want to, categorize really anybody. I apologize. But, he has abstraction as a theoretical pursuit. And he had told me, like, when you find things in paintings, that's a part of both the investigation and also leads to answers or what it is that you find. Like he and I were talking about it because we experience similar things when we paint. And so I think he's different from Barbara because Barbara, she will, in her process, have in mind, I'm interested in this subculture of, say, in Africa, either the ways in which people interact with each other, man and woman.
Can I ask you a question?
Or whatever.
If you don't mind.
Okay.
And this is something that Kathy and I have been discussing. Barbara's Jasmine Garden.
Which is what I was thinking about, right?
Because
technically, the people she depicts is not real.
Nope.
Nor is the world existing.
Or the next question, are they ideal forms?
But like what the point is that it's like, okay, so that goes into the whole thing, new language, new consciousness, what can be seen, and so basically what is left with is what you're saying, a different chronology.
Can I suggest
framing?
Can I if I could interact with you on this? Because and I agree with you, we need to know more about the artist to have a deeper understanding of how the practices of art and science can come together, or how the theories, but we don't,
No, because the Leonardo da Vinci, the whole man thing, the depiction, the actual depiction of man, and then everybody will use it as a reference. Also interacts with whatever logic, philosophy, physics, how you see the world, geography. And I feel like that is that's part of the key. Like, you have a question.
But see, Barbara, that's why, Kathy and I, I was making the state claim, I guess, that I feel the most important of her work is the Jasmine Garden. And the collages, which are more colorful, more decorative, and so on. But the Jasmine Garden collection is, I think, it raises scientific questions.
Like,
you know what I'm saying? Because, go ahead.
Well, another question I have is like, and maybe this is just this might be off topic actually.
Well, go ahead.
Well, movement is like an interesting phenomenon, and like, whether it be like the theory of relativity.
Yeah.
The reason why I bring it up is like realism has different philosophical problems too. Meaning, like,
no, that's right.
Yeah.
You see, the problem, if I could just say,
especially European modernity and
right. Well, part of the problem of realism is that it's too, quote, real.
Yeah.
And too, like a photograph.
Right.
Leonardo,
because that reminds me of
he was trying to discover something. The human was defined.
Literally.
Yeah,
yes. That's literally what came to mind. Where the human, when you had mentioned that in the.
So, and this gets it. Now, Leonardo said that you needed to do anatomy, you needed to do biology, all of these natural sciences. And then, of course, it took him into so many areas of science. But and this is what I have to ask Kathy about. What is Barbara doing in the Jasmine Garden? You know, because these are not real people, but they do represent. Now, her drawings are not as realistic as Leonardo, you know, but
So-called, right.
yeah, but it is a different. Yeah, go ahead.
Because that's why when you make something or depict something, philosophy or the epistemology, like you were saying, matters so much.
Yeah.
Andrew Turner captures movement and realism, meaning because what's important? The Black proletariat, the people, the struggle, like, and it's not for sake of words alone that those, like, I can't say I know Andrew Turner enough to say how he paints, but I know what he's interested enough to see how he would paint in my mind. Meaning, like, for example, an academic or an intellectual will want to talk about brushwork all day long, whether in landscape paintings or in abstractions, but never get to the essence or point of feeling. Like, what is they doing? Like, what is going on? Because what's avoided is not what is avoided is literally a new epistemology by way of talking about techniques or process, or like even the substances that are used to create an image. Like,
But see, the abstract movement is a response to the realism, and probably to Leonardo. Sometimes, in philosophy, art, there are movements and then there are reactions to them. Leonardo starts a movement of world thought, not just of art, but of world thought. And this is Du Bois, Are we to say, let us say, Jackson Pollock is also the beginning of a world movement? Or is it a reaction to something? And I think these are questions that we have to ask of abstract realism, of abstract impressionism, these various mainly 20th century movements. You know what I'm saying? And do they, as counter movements, excuse me, as counter movements, do they occupy the same place of a world movement that changes, has absent, and this is why, one of the questions we would have to put to our observation of Barbara, excuse me, or Andrew.
Completely agree with what you're saying about Barbara. And the other thing that makes me say is, well,
let me just ask this if you don't mind. Do you consider a counter movement to carry the same significance as the movement?
That's the thing. What is the movement? That's what I was about to say. Because
but isn't okay? Let me close this.
I mean that to say that the movement gets obscured.
Okay.
When, because I'm concerned in what the movement is. I'm concerned in, like, I'm concerned with that. I don't know how else to really say that, but I know.
I guess what I'm saying is kind of the way Du Bois said it, how to pinpoint the origins of a world movement. And what is the world movement that he's talking about? It is not just art, and not only art, it is science. And I think the way you also put it, he said a world movement of thought. Isn't that the way he puts it? And I think that is very important because that elevates the whole thing to a new level, a world movement of thought, not only of art. And but good, I interrupted you.
No, I don't agree with you. I agree with you completely. I think everything is connected. The other thing that
But be careful with that everything is connected statement. Because, see, everything is connected statements are often the lazy man's way of obscuring everything. It's not, you understand what I'm talking, because, you hear it all the time. Everything is connected. Okay. And it's such a statement without much consequence. It is a retreat from consequential questions and consequential struggles. But go ahead. I don't mean to. Don't beat me up for saying.
no, because I'm just like no, but what I'm saying is like that like science. Like, okay.
I understand. Yes, they are connected, but how? See, if I say everything is connected, it's like we used to say everything is everything. Okay, all right, yeah, I guess so.
Okay, but my feeling though is about okay. I can't be the one to be like, I know what the origins of the world movement of thought is. That is like I can't argue.
A new movement of world thought.
A new movement of world thought.
That's the way Du Bois.
Right. But I feel like there's a feeling about what it is in the sense of like freedom, the human.
That's what we know now.
Right.
But in the origins, I mean, yes, but one of the things about Leonardo, only surviving 15 paintings. How could a person have that impact with 15 paintings? And then, only half of his written manuscripts, diaries, and so on remain. So we only have a small part of everything of his. But yet, Du Bois assesses him as, and see, this is so, and forgive me, he calls it a world movement of thought. Is that the way he said world movement? I forget how he, but it's a world movement of thought. But the essay is on Leonardo not as an artist, but as
science.
Yes, the origins of experimental science. But then he was an artist. I mean, it's. I think the more we think about it, it is more complicated.
Nor am I saying that just Barbara is an artist in of herself either.
Well, okay, but that's. I think we still have to work this out. Where, I think the Jasmine Garden. I was saying this to Kathy. I think it is her best work, although it is her most scary work to most people because of its eroticism, its sexuality, its subversion of sexual things, and so on. Yeah, I agree with it, but okay, yeah, you see where I'm coming from. But go ahead.
What were you saying?
No, I guess the more we talk, the more I'm confounded and not clear of precisely what Du Bois was saying. Because he says he is the founder of experimental science. empirical science. You know what I'm saying? And he does not say he is the founder of a new humanism that was portrayed in art. You know what I'm saying? And that's, Kathy, you could tell us best how Leonardo was taught, you know? I think more as the humanist, showing, and most, you know, when we're looking at the documentaries, how they talk about him portraying the human, you know, to all of that. But let me let Crystal come.
Well, I found it very interesting, Doc, when you said that, like, God, art, like the link between art and God, or that, and the link being that, like, God represents the unknown that is unknowable.
But knowable.
Yeah, unknown but knowable. And
you take Christianity and even Hegelian thought, one reaches that perfect state of consciousness when one arrives in paradise. That's the Christian eschatology.
And yeah, I think that, well, I was listening to The Three Dimensions of Complete Life, like, over again, and, like, for me, how I understood the height of life was, like, you know, I was struggling with my, like, relationship to God. Like, do I know who God is? Like, do I have a relationship with God? Like, how do I know when I'm walking with God or I'm, like, close to God? And, like, the question of morality and truth, like, how has the question of morality and truth become part of, like, the pursuit of science? And, like, for, like, in asking, like, and when I listened to that sermon again, like, something clicked for me in that I'm like, oh, I think, like, for me, I think, like, I'm closest to God when I'm struggling with morality, the question of morality. And, like, God is with me when I try to do the right thing, when I'm trying to do the right thing. And when I'm trying to discern what is right and from wrong, and I try to, like, act upon that discernment. And yeah, I was also thinking about, like to connect this to the different, like, movements, like, of art. I think, like, what I'm not sure exactly what logical positivism.
Oh, I'm sorry.
is.
Forgive me for that.
But, like, how I understand, for example, like, how Western art moved towards, like, abstraction, like, further and further levels of abstraction, is that, like, they lost sight of the purpose of abstraction, which is, you know, I do think that abstraction is useful in the sense that it can unveil certain universal laws and principles that help us make a leap from, like, mathematics to science, for example. Like, like, shapes. Think about shapes, like a circle or a spiral or, like, a triangle. How there are mathematical principles that, like, can explain what a shape is, but shapes can translate to, like, biology, anatomy, movement, art. And yeah, and if you lose sight of, like, the purpose of abstraction, which is actually to help you, like, connect all these different, like,
absolutely,
like, sciences or ways of knowing the truth, then you lose the human aspect of it, or, like, you lose God as well. So yeah, I feel like this whole, like, I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, how Du Bois can pinpoint, like, makes certain connections, or also Perga, kind of what you were saying, like, how does, like, peace and freedom become the broader unifying principle for a framework of thought, or for, like, a movement of art and science.
Can I just a small thing? The question of abstraction. You know, because Serafina raised abstract art. And the question of abstraction, the category abstraction, pervades many fields, including art, science, philosophy. But abstraction is not the same thing to everybody. And it gets back to the epistemological ground of abstraction. There's abstraction for the sake of abstraction, i.e. abstract art. And many claims are made about it. But then, you get with Marx this idea of the ascendancy to the concrete. From the abstraction is not the highest form, it is the concrete.
Right.
But then what does all that mean? I mean, these are very complicated and difficult questions, and I do agree these are questions for our time and for the people, and I think I agree with you. What are we if we look at a piece of abstract art, let us say Paris, well, what are we looking at? What is his intention? Or, like at Alice's crib, there's a lot of like Basquiat type painting.
Not mine, just to be clear.
Well, your crib. But the question is, are you just being comedic? Is this a comedic laughing at everybody? Or did not fool you? You thought I was doing serious art. I was bullshitting all the time. You know what I'm saying? Which is, but I would say, I would agree with this, if I could just one point, I would agree with you. I think what you're suggesting, Leonardo's, let's say, Mona Lisa, was a form of abstraction arising from the concrete scientific studies that he did. And he was trying to perfect his understanding of the human being, not just the form of the human being, but the human from the inside. That's why he studied muscularity. He even, went and did autopsies on dead people, so he could see, so I would just say, all representation is a form of abstraction. But experimental science is the concrete, as it were. But that's why you could see Leonardo going from the concrete, experimental, scientific to the form in the painting as the abstraction, as you put it. But it is a difficult, very, very difficult question, unresolved. There is no consensus about it in philosophy. So much so that a lot of these questions have been abandoned. Let us do the philosophy of hip hop. Give me a MF break. It's reducing everything to trivia and mediocrity. But this is what a question, as Du Bois wrote it, the origins of a world movement of thought. And so, do you think he was talking about the art or the experiment of science?
I don't think I don't know if they're that divorced from each other.
Okay, right.
No, but maybe they. But what would you?
This is what we have to work out. I don't have the answer. I really don't. But this, and
Well, why would you say that and this is not to say anything about anything. So Barbara, by her Jasmine Gardens, is also an abstraction because
definitely abstraction. But see, the question is, what is what are the empirical research? What is the empirical research that led to the drawings? There is something there, and I mean, we have to just look at. Y'all could look at it better than me and see what I don't see. But go ahead, Dwight.
Oh, I was going to ask Christine, you were asking about logical positivism. So
Speak up just a little bit.
Logical positivism. Logical positivism was a movement that was against metaphysics. Like when you talk about God, it was a movement to emphasize logic empiricism and science. And so a lot of times when they thought that they were going back to Hume, they thought all that metaphysical thing was a bunch of gibberish and nonsense. And I'm just, what I'm getting at is that the point they were trying to make is that that's how you engage in finding truth. You can't find, because as you were talking, as you were explaining, find out morality, like the logical positive was saying, well, those questions are really up in the air, but if we want to get to, we're going to use logic and science because because so many of these questions that you were talking about, they lead to a lot of skepticism. And well, I'm trying to explain. My point is that that is the point of logical positivism. And in terms of even when you look at art, which Seraphine was talking about, I was thinking about Da Vinci. Art moved. When you think about art, they had different movements in art. They had first, Da Vinci, it was real that they were drawing people. And then it has what impressionism, different movements in art, and so it captures the philosophical times about how people express certain ideas in history, because you could see how philosophy and impressive abstract art. And you would think some like some of the logical positives may say, well, how can you understand that art? What's the truth in it? How a personal your interpretation, what the artist saying versus how you interpret it. I mean, these are all just questions that I'm saying that you're raising here that got me thinking about what you're saying. But morality, what's the foundation of morality, and how can we know what's objectively true in the terms of morality? What she said is what she says is true, or what I say is true. It's hard to get to that. But science says, and you can always, science has a more, is based in empiricism, so you can just sort of say, well, this, is right until you, of course, science, if you have paradigms, you go to something else. But science is rooted in more evidence than, say, just speculative thought. I think that. Yeah.
Go ahead, Samir, and then.
But when I was at, now this is related to your conversation about science versus art, and it sounds like what you were saying was art is interesting because it captures the values or ideas of the artists in that time of period in history, and I think it's valuable for trying to derive what we think about morality or epistemology today. But at Mosque 12, Minister Rodney once said something that was interesting to me, that Fard Muhammad, what Elijah Muhammad was doing was excavating what Fard Muhammad had brought, which was a body of knowledge. And what Elijah Muhammad was doing with that body of knowledge was excavating thought. And he was translating the esoteric knowledge of the God, black man. And that body of knowledge became the religion, the Nation of Islam. So I'm not really an art person. I'm more interested in religion, but I think it's overlapping the same function to contain. You said the unknown but knowable.
Yeah.
Or
and see this is where, for instance, movements in philosophy, and that's what logical positivism. It was a movement in philosophy, and they could, just like we can name things whatever we want to. So they called it logical positivism. What they were seeking was a philosophy of science, and this goes back to, Kant was one of the, I think, great attempts at a philosophy of science, a epistemology, a philosophy of knowledge. But in the end, logical positivism failed. Because what it sought was certainty,
Right.
absolute certainty. That's what AI seeks. That's what string theory sought, absolute certainty. And that in itself is an impossibility. It goes along with a kind of secularism, as you're saying about God, the unknown but knowable, and that's not the way most people think about it, but that's basically what it is. But is that not the artistic inspiration at its best? That's why, like you get Basquiat, okay, I'm painting a comic book, and that's the result of a certain philosophy, not a philosophy of science, not rationalism, but it's a philosophy that says that all of this is absurd. The word absurdity in philosophy means nonsense. Makes no sense. That's one. But the movement towards complete certainty also exists side by side with philosophy of the absurd. But then we're back to Du Bois, or for that matter, Einstein. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just saying Einstein played
yeah. See, I think the questions, it's like we got one of those things that you cut down the weeds with. Old school when you have machete or scythe, yeah. It's like you have to cut through all of this jungle of shit, and everybody can stand up for what they want to stand up for. Oh, I believe in this. It don't mean nothing. So, and then you get somebody else that believes, just like the environment in which we live, which I agree with you. This is where epistemology becomes so important to what they call a critical engagement with, people run off at the mouth like it don't mean nothing. I just say whatever I want, like Kendrick Lamar in the Super Bowl. But what you saying, dog? I can't hear you. When some, I got Johnny, I got to turn to you. You got to help me. Because I can't figure out. Well, what are you? But see, it becomes a theater of the absurd, absurdity upon absurdity upon absurdity, and then you figure it out. Well, why I got to figure it out? When your whole project is to create foolishness and call it off. But that's Basquiat. You know what I'm saying? Where it's all a form where a comic book or comic book drawings are as important as, let us say, the Mona Lisa or Jasmine Garden or something. So yeah, go ahead, Samir.
I have a second. Well, relatedly, it's like the art that's on Alice's crib, but not owned by Alice. It'd be.
But then what she owns is she got something that's all that.
But it's a statement. The artist would say, "Oh well, nothing matters," but that in itself is a value statement. That's
of course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is.
And
it's a statement about nihilism.
Right.
Oh, it don't matter. Fuck. Excuse me for saying this in the church. What does it matter? Nothing matters. And my art is, I want to show you that nothing matters. And you're nothing but a joke. Life is nothing but a joke. There is no meaning.
And it's a celebration of puerile, puerile boyishness, infantile. And then the second thing I was going to say is, are you familiar with Lamarck versus Darwin? The conversation about biology, but Lamarck was a biologist who postulated, he hypothesized that traits are inherited from the parent, and if you do something to that organism, it'll change the offspring. And we know that's not true because we know that's DNA, Mendelian genetics won out. But there's a movement in evolutionary biology back to Lamarck because of what's the word epigenetics, where people are now saying that trauma from the parent is stored in the offspring and generational trauma. That's all epigenetics. But it reminded me of what you were saying about Da Vinci or Du Bois, of this idea of, and this happens with artists all the time. Artists only famous once they're dead, of going back to the idea when the idea's time to come, or maybe it's Lamarck's time, but this idea of cycles, cycles of and this reminds me of what I mean. I remember it was outside of Sullivan Hall at Temple in 2016, and you were talking about one epoch has ended, and that was the first time I was exposed to you. This is 2015. But you were talking. But my point is, my point is talking about an epoch ending back in 2015, but the vocabulary of it has changed. So truly, maybe this is Lamarck's epoch. Maybe this is Du Bois's epoch. Now that the pressure of the Cold War is gone, we can reevaluate. If there isn't for America, if there isn't an external enemy like a Soviet Union, maybe we can reevaluate the internal America.
Let me just I feel like I have I might have forgotten some of the things that I say at this point, but going back to this question of, what does the statement of the unity of science and art even mean? It took me, I don't think I fully understand it yet, and it's not a simple statement. It's not as simple as saying we are saying, there should be parallel, science and art should parallel each other I think it's a deeper statement than that. And it's something that Du Bois is saying that Leonardo recognized, and he himself, Du Bois, was putting back on the table, but it has not been taken up sufficiently enough. And my best guess at this point of what the essence of that is really that there was a time when they were complementary methods of getting to the truth about human beings, but also humanity's connection with the natural world, which exists irrespective of the human being. That push and pull. Why am I here, and what is it that I'm here in? And the way I think about the divide between, or why it even sounds like such a crazy thing to suggest that science and art can be joined as almost like a united approach, a necessary united approach for knowing the truth, is because of this sort of tension between the concrete and the abstract, I think, where, when I think science, or it's just assumed that science can more concretely take evidence and then from evidence, I guess, build theories of what the truth is. But art is supposed to sort of just stay at the level of evidence and be a reflection, or it's more just like all art can achieve is a reflection of the truth, but not drive. I don't know how to fully say it, but I feel like this is why I was also thinking about what you brought up, Top, this idea of an ascension to the concrete. I think I was confused about this for very long.
It's very confusing.
Where the idea of the concrete is not, like, the concrete does not just lie in the details or the particularities. I think I get confused about this. about
And it's
sometimes.
very confusing.
Yeah.
Because the concrete does not necessarily mean the
Yeah. Everything that you can tabulate and
ideological
record.
relations can be concrete.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, it is not. Oh, good. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, if it will just help me if I articulate what I'm like now understanding as the concrete. It has to do something about the truth of the human being, and in some ways, I feel like this is also what Crystal, what you were saying about losing the purpose of abstraction. This is what was reminding me of, because in some ways, an abstraction can also serve the purpose of describing something concrete.
Yeah.
I think
Well, that's what it's supposed to be about. But, okay, you can say that, but then the proof is in the doing.
Right.
And we could have a philosophical question from now on about the abstract and what it does and how it functions without any concrete practice of it. This is, and so we're still, I think the essay by Du Bois is an opening to do some of this. And I agree with Jerry and Nuri about this. It is indispensable for the ideological and theoretical struggle of this time. Oh, you said it, in the struggle for peace. Let me let Joe come in.
I'm going to remove myself from this blind discourse, which is outside my very blind discourse you guys are ingesting. I can't handle it.
Go ahead. You're not going to talk about China and Russia.
But I'm saying, in the days when I used to indulge in marijuana, I could sit down, we could have these conversations infinitum.
But isn't it interesting? We do it without marijuana.
That's why I'm lost.
This is all natural. Man. I can't speak for everybody, but I'm doing it without marijuana.
I wanted to get back to something a little bit more pedestrian. That's the 30 days of Trump's presidency.
Could we not go there right now?
Okay.
So we did that earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. Well, go ahead, Dwight.
I want to add on to what you were saying. The question that Du Bois said was about uniting, what was it? Art and science? What was it? What was the statement?
It was, there were two statements, the unity of art.
In Black Reconstruction, he says, he frames it as art using the results of science.
How does he use it?
Art using the results of science.
Really? He says that?
Yeah, in the last chapter. Propaganda.
Art using the results. Well, all I wanted to say is I thought what you were saying was good because science gives us evidence, but I would have asked Du Bois if he was here today, with the book. I would say art for me is something that is an expression of people, the expression of the people. And so science is separate. And that's why, like the logical positive would say, some of the things that artists talk about is gibberish, like, the banana and the
banana on the wall,
duct tape, that type of stuff. What does all that mean? And that was the split. That was the split in the world of art between the realists when impressionism came about, all of that. So I would just say that art, for me, is the way that people, like through writing, is a way of telling us about life. And science is more about, trying to.
What about social science?
Well, social science. Okay, social science, because it involves empiricism. It involves empirical thought.
The art that you're talking about, the banana on the wall, or the art in Alice's crib, isn't that representative of that epistemology of nothing matters? Isn't that infantile because you're basically saying that's what a child goes through? Like they have no responsibility. They can do what they want. They don't have to take care of taxes. But to relate it to Joe's point, isn't that the worldview of the neocons and George Bush? That I'm from that generation. That's when I woke to politics. Basically,
Right.
was the George Bush era.
Yes.
He was basically a clown, a child, the nuclear button.
Sorry, can I finish my thought about the abstraction and the concrete? And I think I want to respond to what I think I'm claiming that there isn't such a hard separation between the two, just the endeavors of science and art. When I was saying that an abstraction can also aim for something concrete about the truth. I'm also saying that art can be, and there was a time when art was thought of as more than just a reproduction of reality, where it also put a demand on understanding more about the world, about the human being. So that's sort of what I'm trying to say, is that this sort of artificial categorization of the concrete as the material, things you can touch and tabulate and list, and then the abstract as just, some form of representing reality, or, just a portrayal, but nothing more than that. I think that is also what Doc's presentation about Du Bois and this idea that he started a new movement of thought. I feel like that is something that puts this on the table now, is that these categories don't serve us anymore. And I think there is a more organic way of understanding the ways in which science and art are not that separate in terms of the purpose that they serve for human beings. And I think this abstraction concrete thing, and the concrete, both the abstract and the concrete are almost turned on its head sometimes in its understanding. And I've always been confused about it. But I felt like first time through this thing of Leonardo, he wasn't really trying to be either a painter or a scientist, or he was trying to be both, It's hard to say what he was trying to be.
Can you separate Leonardo from his theology?
Huh?
I don't think you can separate Leonardo from his theology, because his theology impacted his art. And he made that very clear and very consequential in his writings. And I just wanted to share that. So a lot of the people that you discuss had very poignant theological reference points to shape their life and their viewpoint, the science, the art.
Well, that's true for Gandhi and King as well.
Theological interactions. So I think we would be going to disservice not to try to understand their theological position, whether we agree or disagree.
No, but that's the thing, it's more than the question of whether you agree or disagree. I think I take it what you're saying. I agree with that, because I think King and Gandhi also had.
But can you understand Leonardo da Vinci? Now understand it. I don't think you can probably understand Da Vinci if you don't understand his theology, whether you agree with it or not.
Yes.
Because it's infused with his theology.
Sure.
Okay, and I think sometimes as modernists we do a disservice by trying to partition people's theology and somewhat have a separated viewpoint of what you're trying to convey, and you can't do that and comprehend the message. That's
I think it's also a question whether Leonardo himself was trying to do precisely that, because I think when we talk about science today, I think the movement that comes out of Renaissance, which like Leonardo represented, but so did Martin Luther, which is the question of how is truth related to humanity, and I think like the way we talk about science today. I mean, if you're from the from the university, if the way we talk about science, I don't think it's very different from how like the Catholic Church used to talk about truth, and they would talk about truth in terms of truth being separated from humanity, and I think the movement that like modern science or whatever Leonardo represents, it began was precisely to bring truth, or to see that truth is not independent of human beings. And I was thinking of this also in terms of, well, okay, two things. Firstly, you mentioned Einstein, and I was thinking of the way, like we were exploring this at some point, the way he talks about in physics, or he says, he has this beautiful quote somewhere where he says that like in physics or in science cannot proceed without asking the question of like how, like in a science essentially is a recognition of, or like to analyze the nature of everyday thinking. So he's talking like, like the moment you're talking about science as a reflection of thinking, it means, it's thought of human beings. And so like modern science, and I was thinking of this also in terms of this question of the world movement of thought, because what you're asking about, art and science, or, are they what Purva was saying? Okay, of course, yeah, they're not parallel, they're not it's not a simplistic question of which way you go to reach the truth, but rather the question of the world movement of thought, as I see it, is a question of modernity, which is which is humanity coming into recognition of itself. I think that's what science really also is. I mean, we are not, it's not really a search for truth that's outside of humanity, which is how we are trained to think science is, but I don't think that's true. I think what we're coming to discover is that science, as as like in the broadest ways that science comes about from the Renaissance and like whatever we call modern science, it's ultimately a way of thinking about humanity. It's like it's humanity coming into cognition of itself. And I'm thinking of this also because of the other people we have been studying for a while. Like for instance, everyone talks about Engels and him talking about the recognition of necessity, like the freedom being the recognition of necessity. And then
that's actually Hegel.
That's it, okay. And then you have Kosambi coming in to talk about how science is the cognition of necessity.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that this probably what these people were trying to say is that science is ultimately, or it's part of the project of modernity, which is humanity coming into its own recognition. And that's why what you're saying about the theology question, I'm just wondering if what Leonardo was doing is like bringing theology into science, or was it like creating a new science away from theology?
I mean, from what I know about him, what I read about him, it seems like he was imbued with that there was divinity. There was
right.
There was,
it's like you're trying. I feel like
a different a God that had human characteristics, but at a divine level. Like that everything, this ecosystem around us is not some kind of disordered, spontaneous event, but purposeful through a creative mode. And so that's radically transformative from where some science is today. I mean, we do know science that no science has proved that life can come from non-life. You can't. There's no, okay. We don't really understand why electrons hold together when they should at some point push away. So science breaks down. And unfortunately, in certain academic circles, that can't be openly discussed because then now we're moving to the metaphysical. Okay, because it's the science is breaking down. So then we have to have arguments that go beyond that which can be observed or experimentally repeated. And that's the flaw in science. Science is highly flawed. It takes you to a certain point, then it dissolves because it's not explainable. Why does the universe hold together when the science tells us it shouldn't hold together? In terms of electrons, they push apart.
Well, can I ask whether you think that did it break down or was further progress prevented by certain theories or theoretical conclusions? I think that's why Doc is talking about the Vienna Circle.
Right.
Is those interpretations of quantum mechanics that basically froze things right at the brink of. Because what Einstein was saying, yes, I don't have a theory that explains why electrons really can be held together, but at least I'm starting from the assumption that there is such a theory that we haven't gotten
right.
yet.
But I think the problem, I think that man is very uncomfortable that there is a God, and it's not a God of his own making.
Right.
Okay.
But I feel like
because a God that's not of our own making is can be somewhat frightening. to delve into. So I think there's a degree of escapism that everybody has their own God that they make up. It doesn't, and so if there is a divine order and there is a creator, then we're ultimately responsible for how we live on this earth. And there are consequences to how we live. That's a pretty frightening order to contemplate. So I think a lot of times people, there's so many guys. Your God, everybody go around this table, and nobody would agree with your definition of God is. We get down to the nuance. Okay, what is good? What's good and evil? People don't even have a definition of good and evil. They can agree on.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it would be fair to say that people like Leonardo, in some ways, the science was an expression of their faith, because you're trying to discover creation and discover God's creation. So I think that's also where it's like it's not. I don't see it as too bifurcated. But okay, I wanted to try it. I just wanted to. I feel like you've been bursting to say things, and I've been bursting to say things, and other people have been bursting to say things. No. But I think I wanted to, I guess, try a few things, and also go back to what Emily brought up with Gandhi, in part because, it's always struck me that Gandhi's autobiography is called "The Story of My Experiment with Truth," and when he says experiment, he's not saying like he's going to some like mountain somewhere and experimenting with like some weird cosmic idea of truth, but like his experiment with truth is basically him going to the people of India and to the masses of India. And I just wanted to bring that up because actually it's like, whether it's Gandhi, Du Bois, King, Baldwin, in some ways they all kind of employ this idea of the autobiographical, but also of the experiment, of the almost like the experimentative. And I guess I want to bring it up because like I haven't been thinking about this question of experimentation and what it actually means. And I think it is very, like, I guess I do think it's fair to say that whether it's Indian anti-colonial movement, the world anti-colonial movement, the Black freedom movement, all of these were experiments. And that you can see them also as experiments in many different ways, as experiments in human social organization, as experiments in human capacity, in democracy, in historical change and like the logics of historical change, but also even in the Gandhian and the Kingian sense as experiments with like the world spirit and with morality and also of mankind, literally mankind's relationship with God. And I also want to bring it up because like Emily said, we've been reading Philadelphia Negro, and part of how I even understand Du Bois' approach to social science and like why it arises in the way that it does is because it's like, I think he says this in many different kind of autobiographical places, but that it's like the kind of peculiar and unique position of Black people in America of being like a society within a society, like a nation within a nation. It's a position that almost begs for a kind of social science and begs for a kind of experimentation, because it's like you're dealing with the people who are so hemmed in and oppressed and blocked in by this oppressive social system. And it's like Black people are a unique people in America, in part because they've been so given to like experiment with different ways of how do we achieve freedom? How can we achieve uplift for our people? Like, what is the path forward? And this is a kind of continuous story which has unfolded throughout the entire history of the United States. And he talks about it in like Black Reconstruction, for example, like, oh, like there have been attempts, there have been experiments, there have been all these things that Black people have tried in order to lift themselves up out of this position. And I think you can also, even understand like the Nation of Islam as that kind of experiment as well. And I think I also wanted to bring up, I guess, like that part of it, because that's kind of what shapes Du Bois' whole notion of social science and of experiment as something which is not just the scientist experimenting, but on a whole people experimenting towards freedom. And I guess, I also want to bring it up because when we're saying Du Bois initiates a world movement of thought it's not what I feel like what matters to me is not just the question of thought, but also this question of the world movement. Because we're saying that in a way that, let's say, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment initially are kind of a world movement of thought. This is literally a movement in which all humanity is involved in a struggle of like, yeah, like, what is the human being? Like, what is human society? What does it mean to live together in society? Like, what is modernity? All that stuff. And if we're saying that Du Bois initiates this world movement, like I do think it makes sense to see like the anti-colonial movement, even the Russian Revolution and the Black Freedom movement as all part of a huge experiment in which all humanity is involved in this struggle for knowledge. And I think the last thing I want to say was that something that like we've gotten from even like the early chapters of Philadelphia Negro, and especially when he talks about the second chapter, which is called The Problem, which he's basically laying out, okay, like, why am I doing this? What is my method? And like, he has a particular way of approaching it where he says, the students of these questions must first ask, what is the real condition of this group of human beings, meaning Black people in Philadelphia? Of whom is it composed? What subgroups and classes exist? What sort of individuals are being considered? And further, the student must clearly recognize that a complete study must not confine itself to the group itself, but must specially notice the environment, which is the physical environment of the city, of sections and of houses, but more importantly, the far mightier social environment, the surrounding world of custom, wish, whim, and thought, which envelops this group and powerfully influences its social development. And I feel like basically what he's saying is that, like, if you're trying to understand a whole people and even a people's position in society, like, I think Du Bois's almost like instinctive thing, his kind of intuitive approach is to consider essentially, yeah, like ideology or the world of ideas as part of what fundamentally constitutes a social system and a social environment, and what it basically influences, like, the course of human development. And I think that's important because it's like, in part, it helps me to make sense of even like what we do, which is that we are we are always continually engaged in a kind of experiment and also in a kind of intervention into literally the social environment of the city of Philadelphia. And like, yeah, like anytime we're doing the reading groups, anytime we're doing these events, like even Free School itself every week, this is a kind of intervention into the social, what makes up the social world, which envelops people and which most people are not usually thinking about as something which is like actually a product of human endeavor. And what we're trying to say is that no, like this whole world of ideas, which basically influences the way that like American society develops, like this is something itself that can be changed. And we're part of basically trying to like almost experiment with like, yeah, like can the people be involved in that process of like changing the landscape of ideas? And yeah, so I guess I would just want to say that because I feel like it's also like, even to go back to this question of experimentation, part of what's interesting to me is that like Du Bois, especially in Philadelphia Negro, like because he has this kind of inductive, what he calls like this inductive approach and not a deductive approach, where it's like, he's like, I think he says like, at that time in Philadelphia, there were all these theories about Black people. And he's like, I didn't care about the theories at all. And he was like, well, I really want to know, like, who are these people to begin with? And he, like, I think he says it later. He's like, he says, I started out with no research methods at all. And I asked very little advice as to how to proceed. The problem lay before me, so study it. And I studied it personally and not by proxy. I sent out no canvassers. I went by myself. Personally, I visited and talked with 5,000 people. And I went and like, yeah, and so he goes throughout literally the entire city of like all these wards in Philadelphia where Black people live. And I guess this is part of my question of like experimentation, where do you have to have a hypothesis in order to experiment, or does experiment,
When he talks about experimental science, I don't think, I think he might be talking about what you're saying, but I think really what he's talking about is empirical science in the, in the essay on Leonardo. But nonetheless, the inductive method, as it were. But I'm sorry.
No, that's all I wanted to bring up. Because like even like what do we, if there's a kind of Du Boisian method of experimentation, like how do we see it, and how is it different from kind of these conventional notions of how one is like, you're like literally taught science from like grade school up into college. And it seems to me that even like that kind of, maybe it comes from like Francis Bacon, like that whole concept of science itself is rooted in a certain kind of basic, like underlying fundamental method, which maybe Du Bois offers a slightly different approach.
Do you think we should do a chat?
Okay, we had a lot of comments, but fewer than previous weeks. Bombala, Michelle Bell, Candice Mama, Jacob, W.W. Storm, and MBR say good morning. Hello, free school. W.W. Storm says Democrats love war these days. Bolton and Pompeo should be locked up. Michelle, thank you for the video from Dr. Montero's library talk. It was a really great lecture, Q&A too. Somebody named Eden Seed says, India says China will invade them if the USA goes full warlike on China. Bombala says, I wonder if the US can ever accept not being the most powerful bully on the block. iManifesto says they tried to erase Du Bois for a generation like they did Hazel Scott. iManifesto says, how can one attend a free school meeting? NVR responded saying, you can walk in, the church is in Philadelphia. Bombala said, America needs a new identity. Great lecture, Dr. Montero. There's a conversation in the chat about humans and human systems, whether they're independent, what we mean by human systems. Eden, I think this is just a conversation in the chat, but they're talking about what could save Europe, whether the only possibility is like a remaking of Christianity, the spiritual problems of Europe, that spiritual materialism has made the value of life meaningless. Let's see. MBR says Ben Wharton has some decent insight, and they saw, I think, the interviews with Kishore Mahbubani, I think, and I think this was a comment about DeepSeek, the chief executive, studying something about the architecture of transformers and software. Okay, Eden Seed says, no, the USA fight. It's an economic problem. Political interventions can't change anything. The Western population is decreasing and the global South isn't. Prepare for the unreasonable decree. Yeah, questions of political economy, what actually guarantees security, whether it's wealth, how the United States might still try to maneuver towards dominating the world order, which I think that was a conversation that happened like throughout the chat. Like BK said, Trump preaches peace, not because he's a genuinely benevolent leader. It's a matter of the survival of America and the West because they have lost global economic and military. Trump is now acting in the role of good cop in order for Russia and China to let their guard down some. But long term, the West will attempt to infiltrate them once they're quote friendly. Western imperialism is resetting and reorganizing itself, updating itself based on the political climate. And then, sorry, the comments are a little hard to. Oh, and then Todd was just saying that Hannah Arendt is basically Ayn Rand as far as intellectual lineage goes. They're talking about the space war, the question of whether Trump is a liberal, whether he's coherent to like a Reaganite neoliberalism. And yeah, like again, comments about skepticism about what's really happening in the world, where things will ultimately go, which nobody, I think, can really know. But Bombala says, to stop the funding for a war in which no American is fighting is also suspicious. Were these wars ever about fighting for human rights? MVR is doing I think it's the etymology of epistemology, where it comes from epistome, which means beyond the mouth. So I guess the ideas that lie behind what you're saying.
Say that one more time.
I think they're saying that epistemology comes from epi plus stome or stome, which I guess is like beyond the mouth. But I don't know Latin.
I think it's Greek.
Oh, Greek. Which I know. Okay, and then so BK says the intentions and long-term vision of the elite bloodline remain the same. The approach is adapting. I feel like that kind of gets to what I was trying to say about like epistemology
but butting up against reality, where I feel like part of the elite ideology is the problem is that it's almost like unhinged from reality. Like it wants to be stubborn and not adapt, or like it wants to remain unresponsive to the reality. And I feel like in some ways that even like made me think of like racism, like the Democratic Party's like stubborn neocon insistence on war. Like both of those basically reject the reality of like both what the world's peoples want and also what would even be logical. Okay, and then Eden Seeds and MBR are talking about Carl Jung and Nietzsche. They're saying after
Who and Nietzsche?
Carl Jung.
Oh, Carl Jung, yeah.
After Nietzsche, read Jung's The Answer to Job. You can't understand Jung without reading Nietzsche and the Old Testament. MBR says Nietzsche is a bastard. Yeah. And then my manifesto is consciousness, ancestral memory. And then MBR said no. If you bring a child from an Amazon tribe into New York and nurture them into nuclear scientists, perhaps one could conclude that their doctoral thesis was written as a result of ancestral memory. But that's not true. That's what they're saying. There's sort of like, yeah, a metaphysical, philosophical conversation about consciousness, dialectics, sitting in the unknown, and sitting in the power of an unanswered question, which I think was happening at the time when we were talking about King and God as the unknown yet knowable. Let's see. Yeah, sitting in the unanswered question is painful. Then people are also talking about, I think, science and theoretical relativity. If it's simpler and more complicated than it's presented. Oh, this question of like a renaissance of ideas. I think MBR says the underpinning of a renaissance movement, like the logic or like the limiting factor, I think is what they're saying. A coherent society can only advance as fast as the least of it. And then someone named Peggy or Hongi's Hulk asked, can y'all share links to your readings and assignments? I guess we can't. We don't really have assignments.
But if we're reading things,
yeah, like if there are articles and stuff like that, we can share them. Okay, Bambalai says, see you later. Thanks for the knowledge, free school. And in the infamous words of Don Cornelius on Soul Train, peace, love. My manifesto says Basquiat's very hip hop. Art allows for personal interpretation and expression. Eden Seed says, faith without works is dead. And I think MBR is also more into the etymology again, saying that art is short for artifice or artificial, whereas science comes from sentience or sense. Nathan Reddy had a long comment, which I think Jeremiah actually kind of talked about, but Nathan says, decoupling art and science distorts and impoverishes both, or any entity that calls itself art or science. Their union, I feel, is the realization of capital T truth. I think Gandhi fancied himself more than a social movement leader as a scientist, a moral scientist. He named his autobiography, My Story of My Experiments with Truth. The word experiments invoke science, but his refrain is that he finds ultimate beauty in truth or through truth. This suggests an artistic element to his quest. Truth was to be found with the people, especially the poor, which he calls Daridranarayana. And he says, so that's where he looked and conducted his experiments to uplift them and in turn himself. In a gross way, I figure moral science is the means to a communal, even world ideal. And from what I understand for Gandhi, the means and ends must be equally pure, if not basically synonymous. I can't completely work it out just yet, but I do feel there's a parallel to be made between science and art and means and ends. Anyway, sorry if I'm not making sense. I think that's interesting, yeah, because I feel like the art being tied to the third dimension and like a striving, I was thinking about it in some ways, like it connects to what we were saying about art being very futuristic. And yet science, I feel like, is very process driven. I feel like it's not a complete thought, but I feel. And then BK said, an issue with modern science emerging out of Germany/Europe is its overemphasis on reductionism, and reductionism as the final destination. rarely exploring how the parts contribute to the whole. And then I think MBR is saying that overdeterminism, and then they put in a quote, the context of which I don't know, but the quote is, the people believe we should engage in belligerent activity, even though we hold the right to propagate particular information. And then that's basically the end of the comment.
Wow. I don't know why the comments don't come up on my phone, only some of them.
Yeah, sometimes they just don't.
Oh, you're doing it through Facebook?
This is streaming.
So we get
It's a software.
This is what we're streaming from, so we get that.
We get administrative view.
you can sit next to Nuri.
Yeah, we sit next to each
Oh
other.
yeah.
So I had a question. I think I'm struggling a little bit trying to understand what we were talking about in terms of Leonardo's abstractions. I think that I'm a little lost on that part because I remember we watched this documentary on Leonardo, and they were saying how Leonardo like worked on very few things of him survived, and he left a lot of his work unfinished, and that was to a large extent because he was very dissatisfied with how the thing turned out, because he used to study human anatomy and the physics of lighting and shadows and all of these things, and whenever he thought that any small tiny part of his paintings did not represent the truth or reality, he was very disappointed with it, and he kind of abandoned it and tried, and I don't know, went back to the drawing board, did more experiments, tried to find out what would really happen. Like he was like, okay, even facial expressions which were informed by his study of musculature and all of these things. So in my head, I thought abstractions were supposed to be something that did not have a real life model
or concrete reference.
Right.
And see, this is the great question, and perhaps we won't answer it today.
Okay.
But I think as we get back into the science reading group and start organizing for the next knowledge conference, I think this will have to be a part of it. And part of the confusion in science and social science is the question of the abstract. We are overdetermined by British empiricism, the immediacy. But we can talk more about this. I think this is something that is very necessary in understanding art and science and abstraction in both fields.
Yes.
It is a very complicated, and I'll need all the help in the world from my resident philosopher, because I don't completely know. There's a Kantian solution, there's a Humean solution, even presume there's a Leonardo da Vinci solution to the problem, and not just the solution at the level of thought, but the level of practically doing it in a way, you know what I'm saying? It is very, very difficult right now. And it will take some preparation. I guess I have to work with Lurba on this.
Can I suggest one more
Yeah,
thing?
please.
All of this is also making me think that maybe revisiting Robeson is going to be very important because of what he says about the symbol, like the image of a mother with a child can concretely symbolize the good, or that's. I think that was at the back of my mind. But anyway, I just wanted to throw it out there. I think it would be useful.
Well, can I respond a little bit? Well, I've been feeling a lot of pressure this whole conversation. I'm just going to preface it because I've been thinking, as someone who studied art so long, I feel so ill-equipped actually from my education to answer or talk about any of these things. And that's why I feel like I was so unhappy with my own education and why I think preschool obviously is a better place to be talking about this. But I appreciate that you asked this question of like, you brought it back, Shantanu, around this question of what about somebody who dedicated their life to studying the most precise depiction of reality, where in that can you find abstraction? I feel like part of it is that also that like, I think the point you were trying to make, Doc, is that like inherent in any, well, if you were to like think about art, and I think we have a lot of different ways we've been talking about art today, but if we just had to focus it on the act of depiction, if it's a human being depicting reality, there will always be an epistemology, basically is what we're saying. There will always be assumptions. There will always be an effort to understand the world through a human effort, like a human. And so that will always, I think, influence like the ultimate depiction, which is to say there is something when you look at an artwork, or even if you like, it is like done by you know, the phrase is like it's done by Leonardo's hand, and there will be carrying within it Leonardo's assumptions, his studies, his understanding of not only like, I feel like the example you gave of like facial expressions is a really good one, because how do you understand, and this is where we were, I think this is kind of getting at what the conversation I think we were starting to have about like Leonardo versus Barbara, but that basically what Leonardo is most known also as, like when you read writings from even the time of the Renaissance, when they were starting to understand like what it was they were trying to do with this new movement in art and also thought, the writings, you know, really praise Leonardo for being able to depict like not only like the anatomy, the musculature, the anatomy, but also the grace of the person, the glint in the eyes that was just specific to that person, which makes you wonder, like, how do you know the human being? You must know them through not only, you know, the physical studies, but also even, would you know a person if you also don't know anything about their personality? And therefore, that's why his portraiture, it's almost like, I know that's like the portraiture I commissioned of my wife, because not just because you got her likeness right, but you add the right glint in her eye or in her like fingertips, or this like very like the grace or whatever. And it's like that human element that I think that brings it back to the Du Boisian conversation we're having, in terms of, yes, you can know the African American through like the demographics, the geography, but do you know their strivings? Do you know their aspirations? Do you know their song, their music, and like their laughter, their sorrows, that sort of thing? But the other thing I was gonna say is that where I think I was having two things. I also think in this conversation about even the Toronto question we talked about earlier, which is like, is abstraction or realism but like we didn't simplify it to that, but I think there's also, I think we went far more beyond that. But I also wanted to say that there are times when even the over reliance on realism can also obscure. And I don't want to pick on like photography, but I know Michelle, you and I have had conversations about this, but there are times when photography is also presented as realistic or even truthful, when we all know like photography can carry assumptions that about people that are also like not believing that they are human beings. But you can't fall into that trap of believing that like it is just because it's photographic, it's exactly reality, it's exactly the truth, because we all know that like I guess a lot of colonial expeditions carried photographers to, you know, carry back anthropological images of like men, women, and children that had nothing to do with who they really were, but really everything to do with white supremacy. But the third thing I wanted to say, I'll make this one of the last things, which is like, I was trying to remember what I said to you about what it is that I believe that Barbara Bullock could transcend Leonardo in certain ways, which is that I think in Leonardo's time, like, I noticed like a lot the drawings of like the individual, like that famous man and the circle and the perfect, like that's beautiful and that's important, that's scientific, and that's also an expression of the humanism that we're still trying to understand, and that the individual human being could finally be like lifted out of like the suppression of like what understand like the church and the state and actually studied. But I think the strength of something like the Jasmine Garden series is also not only that the faces of these men and women are also like almost like African masks, like the kind of like almond shaped eyes and like hair always in locks and then like lips always in a certain way, but also that they're it's always about attraction, love, sexuality, but overall like social relations. And I only know I mean there are some depictions of like, Leonardo's paintings of like the mother-child relationship or maybe Jesus and his disciples, but what is actually, how do you capture something so non-material but also very concrete, which is love? How do you capture something that is like so like this Black social system? Can you measure that? You can actually, I'm sure you can study, like that's why demography matters, but also there's something human to that I think that's why, like, also, I guess almost excavating that in the midst of a white supremacist social system is not something necessarily that Leonardo did. Like, that was not necessarily his task or his calling, but it was something that somebody like Barbara Bullock had to advance. And that's why I think there's something transcendent in that quality and that necessity for freedom and love to be like paramount in Barbara Bullock's works. And I think that that's something that I will say I'm in this time and this moment, I'm almost like more immediately drawn to as a quality in Barbara Bullock's work. But I forgot what I was going to say. But the last thing I'll say is that I know in the conversation about art and science that I still also don't know exactly where I fall. There's so many things we have yet to like, I think, discover. Is I'm just remembering that that essay that we actually began with at the Lucian Blackwell Library, which is the creative process that Baldwin wrote, in which he says also that the artist is unique because he has his own laboratory, his own test tube, which I think is so interesting because I know we're talking about the artist, also the scientist, but also is it that like artists are just scientists, but they don't know it yet, or scientists are they know it yet? Are they both just like methods to understand, like tools to understand reality, or is it something? There's a lot of, I think, but is art also encompassing like this dimension of the imaginary, which the science also does encompass, but must also, I guess, recenter itself.
The question is, can they be these things rather than are they?
Right.
Well,
yeah, that's what I feel like we're both not struggling with, but also just working through actually in our own process, which is there is what science has been, and there's what art has been, and there's what like art and science have been told to us being, and then there's what art and science once was, because in the Renaissance, like I'm pretty certain, like as we were saying, like Leonardo didn't set out to be an artist or a scientist. Most of them didn't think in those categories. They didn't have all this cleavages and schisms that were like imposed on them, but also in this time when the necessity for new knowledge and like and a revolutionary movement of you thought this is the moment to be pushing all of those things aside and restoring art and science to what it should and could be. Is that right? Like that's what I think I've struggled with the most, because I've like tried to write down in this time like what I think art has been, and it is limited, it is narrow, it is confined, it is set as an antithesis to science, but it's not necessarily that's not what it could be or should be, and really even is.
Wow. I think we might get ready to leave. It's been a very long day. Guess I got a fight to go to. The Super Bowl of boxing.
Is there going to be a parade?
Yeah, fly.
Alice and I will have our proof.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for all the
Okay, so how are you leaving now?